There is a place on this earth where the ground does not behave the way ground is supposed to behave, where red dust rises in spirals for no apparent reason, where compasses drift and lose their sense of direction, where animals refuse to walk certain paths, even in drought, even when the water on the other side should have drawn them through. We're the oldest living culture on the planet, people whose ancestors have stood on this same soil for at least 65,000 years have been whispering the same warning across every single generation, right up until today. Do not dig here. Do not disturb what sleeps beneath. For most of the 20th century, the scientific world treated those warnings the way it treated most things that came from indigenous knowledge. It filed them away under the category of mythology, folklore, spiritual belief. Interesting, perhaps. Worthy of respectful acknowledgement, certainly, but not data, not evidence, not something that could tell you anything real about the physical world. Then the scientists looked. What they found beneath the outback, beneath those ancient red plains that stretch across the heart of the Australian continent, did not fit neatly into any existing model. It did not fit into the geological timelines they had been working with. It did not fit the archaeological record they thought they understood, and it most certainly did not fit the comfortable assumption that a people with no written language, no metal tools, and no formal institutions of science could have been accurately transmitting factual information about the physical world across 50,000 years of oral tradition. But they had, and in some cases, what those elders described matched what the instruments were detecting with a precision that made researchers go very quiet. This is the story of what was found. It is the story of what was warned. And it is the story of what those two things, the warnings and the findings, tell us about the age of human knowledge, the nature of memory, and the possibility that the deepest mysteries on this planet have been sitting right below our feet the entire time, tended and guarded by people we were too arrogant to listen to. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. I always check the comments and it fascinates me every single time. Someone in Melbourne watching the sunrise, someone in London at midnight, someone in Arizona at 2 in the morning. All of us stretched across this planet, listening to the same story about the oldest story on Earth. Let's start at the beginning. And with this topic, the beginning is further back than most people are prepared to go. 65,000 years. That is the number that changed everything when it was confirmed in 2017. Researchers working at the Majibebe Rock Shelter in the Northern Territory of Australia presented a body of evidence that placed human occupation at that site at a minimum of 65,000 years before the present. Prior to that announcement, the accepted timeline for human arrival in Australia had been sitting at around 50,000 years. The revision did not merely shift a date. It fundamentally altered the conversation about human prehistory on every continent. Because 65,000 years ago, the rest of the world was still, by most academic definitions, in its early chapters. Europe had anatomically modern humans moving through it, but Neanderthal populations were still very much present across the western portion of that continent. The Americas had no humans at all, not for another 40,000 years or more. The great agricultural revolution that would eventually give rise to Mesopotamian cities and Egyptian monuments was so far in the future that the concept of farming had not yet been imagined anywhere on Earth. And in Australia, people were already painting the walls of rock shelters, grinding seeds on stone, and beginning the longest continuous cultural tradition in human history. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia did not arrive and then stay still. They moved through a continent that was, in many periods of prehistory, dramatically different from the one that exists today. During periods of glacial maxima, sea levels dropped enough to expose a landmass that connected parts of what is now New Guinea to the northern coast of Australia. The continent was larger. Its rivers ran differently. Its climate shifted between periods of intense arid conditions and periods of greater rainfall, creating and then erasing vast inland lakes that left no surface trace today, only the memory of their presence encoded in the landscapes and in the stories. This is the part that researchers began to take seriously only in the last few decades. The stories. In 2015, a team of geoscientists in Australia began a systematic study of Aboriginal oral traditions from coastal groups around the continent. They were looking for a specific thing. Descriptions of landscapes that match the coastline of Australia, not as it exists today, but as it existed at various points during the last 20,000 years, when sea levels were dramatically lower. The flooding of those coastlines, as the glaciers melted and sea levels rose, happened progressively between approximately 20,000 and 7,000 years ago, with the most dramatic flooding occurring between about 12,000 and 7,000 years ago. What they found in those oral traditions was stunning. Across more than 20 distinct language groups, with no apparent communication between them across these enormous stretches of time, they found stories that described specific bays, headlands, islands, and coastal features that had not existed above the waterline for thousands of years. The locations matched. The geological events described in the stories, the flooding, the submergence of landmarks, the appearance of new islands as other land was swallowed, these matched the known sea level records. The team concluded that they were looking at oral traditions that had preserved accurate geographical information about real physical events across a minimum of 7,000 years, and in some cases potentially 10,000 years. 10,000 years of accurate geographical memory, transmitted through storytelling, maintained without writing, without maps, without instruments. And then someone asked the question that changed the frame of the entire inquiry. If the coastal stories are accurate to that degree, what about the inland stories? Because the inland stories were something else entirely. Among the Arante people of Central Australia, among the Anangu, whose country encompasses the region around Uluru, among the Warlpiri, the Pitjantjatjara, and dozens of other groups whose territories span the interior of the continent, there existed a body of knowledge about the land beneath the visible surface that outsiders had always categorized as ceremonial knowledge, as dreaming stories, as the mythological cosmology of people who explained the world through narrative rather than measurement. Some of those stories described things coming from beneath the ground, not metaphorically, not as symbols for spiritual forces, literally, things that came up from below. Events that shook the earth, places where the ground itself was different from the ground around it, where the soil held properties that affected living things in ways that could be felt, where certain trees did not grow the same way they did elsewhere, where water gathered or refused to gather in patterns that defied the simple topography of the surface. And the elders maintained, across generations, that certain places must not be disturbed. For most of the colonial period in Australian history, this maintenance of restricted sites was treated as a legal obstacle to mining and development, as a cultural sensitivity to be managed and minimized, but not as information. Not as data about what was actually under the ground. Then came the geologists. The Australian continent sits on one of the most geologically stable cratons on Earth. The western and central portions of the continent are underlaid by some of the oldest exposed rock on the planet, formations that date back billions of years, predating complex life entirely. This ancient foundation was understood to be tectonically quiet, seismically inactive by comparison to the dynamic plate boundaries around the continent's edges, and geologically uninteresting in terms of its surface expression. Except it was not uninteresting at all. It was just that no one had looked carefully enough. When researchers began conducting detailed geophysical surveys of the interior, using magnetometry, gravimetric analysis, and eventually airborne electromagnetic scanning systems that could build three-dimensional maps of subsurface structures, they began revealing a world beneath the outback that no surface observation had prepared them for. There were structures down there. Not geological structures in the conventional sense, not just the layers of ancient sedimentary and igneous rock that everyone knew about. There were features with distinct boundaries, symmetrical in ways that natural geological formation processes do not typically produce, and they were buried under tens of meters of sediment that was itself ancient enough that nothing happening after its deposition could have created what lay beneath. Some of these features were eventually attributed to impact events. Australia, it turns out, has a remarkable history of being struck by objects from space, and many of these impact craters had been so thoroughly eroded and buried over hundreds of millions of years that they were completely invisible from the surface. The geophysical signatures remained. but the craters themselves had long since been ground down, buried, and sealed beneath younger material. What made this relevant to the Aboriginal knowledge question was what began to emerge when researchers started comparing the locations of geophysically anomalous sites with the locations of places that elders had maintained were restricted, significant, or in some cases dangerous. The correlation was not perfect. It was not the kind of clean match that would satisfy a statistician looking for unambiguous causation, but it was far too consistent to dismiss. Sites that Aboriginal custodians had identified as places of particular power or particular prohibition tended to cluster around locations where the subsurface geophysics were unusual. Not always, not exclusively, but enough times, in enough independent cases, that researchers who encountered the pattern found themselves asking a question they had not expected to be asking. How did they know? The most straightforward answer, and in science the most straightforward answer is usually the one worth pursuing, was that they observed. For 65,000 years, people living on this land had been watching it. They had been watching what grew where and what refused to grow. They had been watching where animals went and where animals avoided. They had been watching how water moved and where it pooled, and where it seemed to disappear into the ground in ways that did not match the surface drainage patterns. They had been watching the sky and the ground and the behavior of every living thing within their territory, across more generations than anyone outside this culture can easily comprehend. And what they observed, they encoded. They put it into the only storage system available to them: story, ceremony, song. The songlines of Australia are perhaps the most widely discussed element of Aboriginal cultural tradition in the popular imagination, and also perhaps the most widely misunderstood. The popular conception of songlines tends toward the lyrical and the metaphorical. Routes across the landscape navigated through music, the land itself described through melody. This is true, but it is only the surface of a much more complex information system. At their deepest and most complete, the songlines function as a layered encoding of geographical, ecological, astronomical, historical, and what we might call geological knowledge about specific territories. The song is the map, but the map contains more information than coordinates. It contains records of significant events, behavioral instructions for interacting with the landscape, warnings about specific locations and what those locations have done or could do, and embedded within all of this, descriptions of physical features of the land, both visible and invisible. The challenge for researchers trying to interface with this knowledge system is that the most detailed and significant portions of it are held within highly restricted ceremonial contexts. They are not freely shared. They are not written down. They are transmitted through initiation, through years of learning, through relationships of trust and responsibility that the academic system is not well designed to replicate. But enough has been shared, by elders who chose to share it, in enough contexts where researchers were prepared to listen without immediately trying to translate it into their own frameworks, that a body of genuinely remarkable correspondences has begun to accumulate. One of the most discussed involves Lake Eyre, known by its Arabana name as Kati Thanda, the Great Salt Lake in the northeast of South Australia that is the lowest point on the Australian continent and the terminus of a vast and ancient drainage system. The Arabana people's relationship with Kati Thanda spans the entirety of their cultural memory. Their stories about the lake describe it not only in its current form as an intermittently flooded salt flat, but in forms that correspond to earlier periods when it held permanent water, when the rivers that now reach it only in exceptional rainfall events ran full and constant, when the surrounding landscape was dramatically different. Some of those descriptions match conditions that geological research has now dated to between 15,000 and 50,000 years ago. The Arabana were describing a lake that they had never seen, or rather their ancestors had seen it, had lived beside it, and had encoded that memory in stories that survived the intervening tens of thousands of years of telling. But the stories about what was beneath Kati Thanda went further than descriptions of the lake's historical water levels. They described things about the substrate, the material under the lake bed, that had not been scientifically investigated until the late 20th century. When that investigation happened, It found that the Kati Thanda Basin sits above geological structures that include mineral concentrations of a type that the Arabana stories, in their oblique and encoded way, had been pointing toward all along. Let us be careful here. The elders were not describing ore deposits in the language of a mining survey. They were describing the land in the language of the dreaming, which is a cosmological and relational language, not a resource extraction language. What they were describing was the character of that part of the country, the way it behaved, the way it related to the living things around it, the kind of power it held. When scientists started asking what was physically different about the areas the elders had identified as powerful or significant or requiring special protocols of approach and behavior, what they sometimes found was that there were real physical differences. The ground was different, the chemistry was different, the subsurface structure was different. And then the question opened up even further. Because if Aboriginal oral traditions had been accurately preserving geographical memory for 10,000 years, and if they had been encoding information about subsurface geological conditions across similar timescales, then what else had they been preserving? What other categories of information, dismissed for 2 centuries by the colonial scientific establishment as primitive mythology, turned out to be something quite different? The answer to that question takes us to one of the most extraordinary scientific debates of the last 20 years. And it requires us to talk about the sky. In 2010, a researcher named Dwayne Hamaker began publishing work that would eventually form the basis of an entirely new academic field: cultural astronomy, specifically the systematic study of Aboriginal astronomical knowledge. What Hamaker and his collaborators documented was a body of astronomical knowledge held within Aboriginal traditions that was, in multiple respects, more sophisticated than anything the European scientific tradition had produced until the invention of the telescope, and in some cases more sophisticated than what European science had produced well after that. Aboriginal groups across the continent had developed detailed and precise knowledge of the movements of celestial bodies. They knew the cycles of Venus with precision that rivaled the Babylonians. They had identified the seasons not by arbitrary calendar divisions but by the heliacal risings and settings of specific stars, and this system was calibrated to ecological events, the flowering of specific plants, the migrations of specific animals, the arrival of specific weather patterns, with an accuracy that required generations of meticulous observation to develop and maintain. Some groups had identified that the Milky Way was a structure of stars, rather than simply a luminous band in the sky. Some had detected the variability of specific stars, noting that Betelgeuse in the constellation Orion changed in brightness over time. European astronomers did not confirm the variability of Betelgeuse through instrumental observation until the 19th century. But here is the piece that connects the astronomical knowledge to what lies beneath the outback. Across multiple Aboriginal traditions, there are stories that describe events of fire from the sky, objects that came down, events that shook the earth, that burned the land, that changed the shape of the country. Some of these stories are attached to specific geographic locations, and when researchers began investigating those locations, they found impact craters. Not all of them. Not every story matched an identified impact structure. The relationship between the stories and the physical evidence is, as with everything in this field, complicated by the difficulty of dating both the geological events and the stories themselves. But enough correspondences emerged to establish that the possibility was real. Aboriginal oral traditions might contain accurate records of impact events that occurred hundreds, possibly thousands, and in some cases potentially tens of thousands of years ago. The Henbury meteorite craters in the Northern Territory are perhaps the most documented case. These craters, a cluster of more than a dozen impact structures in the James Range, were known to Western science through their discovery in 1931. But Aboriginal stories from the Aranda people describe them with a specificity that went beyond what casual surface observation would suggest. The stories describe the nature of the event, not just the resulting structures. They described fire coming from the north and striking the earth in a cluster. They described the effects on the land and on living things in the area, and they maintained a prohibition against eating the animals from around those craters. When researchers analyzed the soil and water chemistry around the Henbury craters, they found elevated concentrations of nickel and other heavy metals from the meteoritic material. The prohibition against eating local animals was, from a purely practical standpoint, sound advice. Animals eating vegetation that was taking up those metals from the soil would themselves be accumulating those metals. The elders had encoded a genuine health warning within a story that sounded, to outside ears, like a spiritual prohibition. How long had that prohibition been in place? The Henbury impact event itself has been dated by multiple methods to somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 years ago. The story has been maintained for at least that long, possibly, given the stability of the surrounding cultural tradition, considerably longer. This is the kind of convergence that researchers in this space find themselves sitting with. The data keeps pointing in the same direction. The oldest continuous culture on Earth, the one that developed on the oldest exposed continent, the one that survived at least 2 documented near-extinction level population bottlenecks in the archaeological record, preserved accurate empirical information about the physical world across timescales that we do not have adequate categories for describing. And not just about the sky, and not just about the coast, and not just about craters, about the deep structure of the Earth itself. In the 1990s, the Australian mining industry was in the middle of a major expansion, driven by global demand for iron ore, nickel, copper, uranium, and gold. The remote interior of the continent was increasingly the frontier of this expansion, and the geological surveys required to support it were becoming increasingly sophisticated. Remote sensing technologies developed for military applications were being adapted for resource exploration. Airborne electromagnetic systems, originally designed to detect submarines, were being used to map subsurface conductivity anomalies that could indicate the presence of metallic ore deposits. These surveys were revealing a world beneath the outback that geologists found extraordinary in its complexity. The ancient craton that underlies central and western Australia, the Yilgarn and Pilbara cratons in the west, the Gawler craton in the south, these ancient foundations were riddled with structures and mineral concentrations of a richness and variety that the surface gave no hint of. Australia, it turned out, sat on some of the largest undiscovered mineral deposits on Earth. Some of those deposits were in places that Aboriginal custodians had identified as significant or restricted. The negotiations and conflicts that arose from this intersection, the mining company interests on one side, the Aboriginal cultural heritage protections on the other, generated enormous political and legal heat in Australia through the 1990s and into the 2000s. The Native Title Act of 1993 had created a legal framework for recognising Aboriginal rights over traditional lands, and the question of who had authority over what lay beneath those lands was fiercely contested. But within that political and legal conflict, a quieter conversation was beginning to develop between some geologists and some Aboriginal knowledge custodians, not everywhere, not systematically, but in specific places and with specific researchers who were willing to approach the knowledge differently, conversations that produced remarkable results. In the Pilbara region of Western Australia, a senior Banjima man named Felix Haynes worked with researchers from the CSIRO, Australia's National Science Agency, in the early 2000s to document knowledge held within Banjima oral tradition about the iron-rich country of the Hamersley Ranges. The Banjima described different parts of their country in terms of its character, its behaviour, its relationship to weather, to plants, to water. These descriptions, translated out of the ceremonial language in which they were originally encoded, mapped with unexpected precision onto the known geology of the region, including the distribution of the iron ore deposits that the mining companies had been drilling for. The elders were not using the language of geology, they were using the language of country, but they were describing the same physical realities that the drill cores and the geophysical surveys were revealing. Haynes told researchers that this knowledge was not new. It was not something that had been recently developed by Banjima people learning to interpret the mining company's data. It was old knowledge, knowledge that had been held within the culture for generations, encoded in the stories about the character of different parts of the country and the appropriate protocols for interacting with them. Old how long? That is always the question. And that is always the question that is most difficult to answer, because we have no way of directly dating oral knowledge. We cannot carbon date a story the way we can date a piece of charcoal from a hearth. We can only look at what the story describes, compare it to what we know about when specific geological features formed or specific events occurred, and work backwards from there. And when researchers do that work, what they sometimes find is that the stories are describing things that happened a very long time ago. The geological history of the Pilbara is, by any measure, extraordinary. The banded iron formations that make the Hamersley Ranges among the richest iron ore deposits on Earth formed between 2.4 and 3.5 billion years ago, during the Proterozoic and Archean eons, when the chemistry of Earth's early oceans was depositing iron in layers as the first photosynthetic organisms began producing oxygen. These formations are not the product of recent events. They are among the oldest visible features on the planet's surface. Aboriginal knowledge about the character of this country predates any Western awareness of it by, at minimum, 65,000 years, and likely much longer. The knowledge encoded in the stories reflects observation across that entire period. Observation of how the land behaves, how it affects the living things on it, what it does with water, what grows and does not grow within it, what the animals that live in it do and do not do. None of that observation can tell you that the iron ore formed 2 billion years ago. But it can tell you that this ground is iron ground, that it behaves like iron ground, that it should be treated in the ways that iron ground requires. And when the mining companies sent in their surveys and found iron ground, exactly where the Banjima stories said there was iron ground, that was not mythology, that was knowledge. The same pattern has appeared in multiple contexts across the continent. In South Australia, in the Northern Territory, in Western Australia, in Queensland. In each case, the specific language and ceremonial structure of the knowledge differs. The Aboriginal cultures of Australia are not a monolith. They are hundreds of distinct nations, each with their own language, their own territorial knowledge, their own relationship to the land they have managed for all those thousands of years. But the fundamental principle is consistent. The deep knowledge of country, encoded in stories and ceremony, reflects genuine, empirically grounded observation of the physical world, transmitted across time scales that challenge every assumption we make about what is possible for pre-literate cultures. But we have not yet gotten to the strangest part. The strangest part is not the mineral knowledge, as remarkable as that is. The strangest part is what the knowledge describes as happening, not what the land contains, but what the land does. In multiple Aboriginal traditions from different regions of the continent, there are descriptions of the ground moving. Not in the sense of earthquakes, though earthquakes are also described in some traditions with remarkable accuracy, but in a more specific sense, the ground breathing. The land shifting slowly, across time scales that no single human life could observe, but that accumulate into changes that a culture maintaining continuous observation across thousands of years could detect. When geophysicists in the 21st century began discussing what happens to the Australian craton over geological timescales, they described something that sounded uncannily like what the elders had been saying. The Australian continent is moving northward at a rate of approximately 7 centimeters per year. It has been doing this for millions of years. As it moves, it changes its relationship to the equatorial heat belt, altering long-term climate patterns. The aridification of the Australian interior, the transformation of what was once a wetter, more heavily vegetated continent into the desert-dominated landscape that exists today, is a consequence of this movement. And that process of aridification has been going on for the entire duration of Aboriginal occupation. The elders did not know about plate tectonics, but they knew that the land changed. They knew that country that was one kind of place becomes another kind of place over time. They had observed it across enough generations to know that the change was real, directional, and ongoing. And in their stories, they encoded the memory of earlier forms of the land, earlier climates, earlier water, earlier skies. When researchers studying the geological history of Australian aridity examined the Aboriginal oral traditions that described wetter environments, they found that many of those descriptions were not fanciful or symbolic. They were describing landscapes that paleoclimatological data confirmed had existed, in some cases hundreds of thousands of years ago, in others more recently, but consistently at times before the current extreme aridity. The traditions were carrying memory of the land before the desert. The land before the desert. Let that sit with you for a moment. The Aboriginal cultures of Australia have been maintaining, within their oral traditions, accurate memory of what this continent looked like before the processes that created the modern Australian arid zone had fully played out. They have been preserving that memory, transmitting it, encoding it in story and song and ceremony, not because they understood the geological mechanisms involved, but because the observation was important, because the knowledge was useful, because the land demanded to be remembered in its fullness. And then something happened in 2023 that pushed all of this into a different dimension entirely. The Australian government, in partnership with several universities and the CSIRO, launched the most comprehensive geophysical survey of the Australian interior ever conducted. The AusGeoid project, combined with newly processed satellite gravity data and a continent-wide airborne electromagnetic survey campaign, produced a three-dimensional model of the Australian subsurface with a resolution and completeness that had never previously been achievable. What the model showed, when the data was fully processed and analysed, was not what anyone had expected. Beneath the red plains of the central outback, beneath the ancient lake beds and the salt pans, and the endless horizons of spinifex grass, the model revealed a network of structures that the geological community had not previously identified. Linear features running for hundreds of kilometers beneath the surface, following orientations that matched neither the known surface drainage patterns nor the established geological structures of the craton. Density anomalies, places where the material below ground was significantly denser or less dense than the surrounding rock, in configurations that suggested not random mineral heterogeneity, but something more structured. And in multiple locations, something that the geophysicists who first looked at the data described in their internal communications, before the more careful language of scientific publication took over, as chambers, void spaces, or at least spaces filled with material dramatically different from the surrounding rock, at depths ranging from a few hundred meters to several kilometers below the surface. The word chambers is problematic in a scientific context because it carries implications about origin and formation that the data alone cannot support. The proper scientific language is subsurface void-like anomalies, or low-density inclusions, or cavitational features. But the people looking at the data use the word chambers, and the image it conjures is not entirely misleading. There are hollow or low-density spaces beneath significant portions of the Australian interior. Some of them are very large. The largest identified in the initial survey is estimated to have a horizontal extent of several kilometers and a vertical dimension that has not yet been fully resolved, somewhere between 50 and several hundred meters. What are they? That is the question that researchers are now working to answer, and the answers being proposed range from the entirely mundane to the genuinely extraordinary. The mundane explanation is karst. Australia has extensive karst topography, regions where soluble rock, primarily limestone but also dolomite and other carbonate formations, have been dissolved by groundwater over geological timescales to produce cave systems and underground voids. The Nullarbor Plain, the vast flat expanse of southern Australia, is a classic example of karst topography. It sits atop one of the largest networks of limestone caves in the world. Many of those caves contain ancient fossil deposits and in some cases evidence of very early Aboriginal habitation, but karst cannot explain all of what the surveys are showing. The structural characteristics of the low-density anomalies in the central interior do not match what karst dissolution typically produces. The orientations are too consistent. The boundaries between the anomalous material and the surrounding rock are too sharp in some cases, too gradual in others, in patterns that do not fit the models of how water-dissolved karst systems form. Some researchers have proposed that portions of what the survey is detecting are impact-related, the remains of structures formed by ancient meteorite impacts, where the energy of impact created fractured and brecciated rock that has different density characteristics from the intact rock around it. Australia has more confirmed impact craters than any other continent, a consequence of its ancient, stable craton surface preserving impact signatures that would be eroded away in geologically younger or more tectonically active regions. It is entirely plausible that there are many more ancient impact structures beneath the outback than have currently been identified. But there is a third category of explanation, one that the researchers working on this data are pursuing with what they describe, in careful academic language, as considerable interest: hydrothermal systems. When magma moves through the crust of the Earth, it heats groundwater. The heated water circulates through the surrounding rock, dissolving minerals, creating chemical reactions, sometimes forming large-scale circulation systems that can persist for millions of years after the initial magmatic event that created them. Over time, as the system cools and the water chemistry changes, the minerals that were dissolved may be redeposited, creating unusual concentrations and, in some cases, leaving behind void spaces where the circulation was most intense. The Australian craton, for all its surface stability, has not been geologically inactive across billions of years. There have been periods of volcanic activity, of intrusion, of deep crustal heating that set up hydrothermal systems on enormous scales. The signatures of those systems are preserved in the rock record, and some of the structures the new surveys are revealing may be the deep remnants of ancient hydrothermal circulation that occurred hundreds of millions or even billions of years ago. Here is why that matters for the Aboriginal knowledge question. Active hydrothermal systems and semi-active systems that still retain elevated temperatures or unusual geochemistry at depth affect the surface world in ways that are subtle but detectable over long periods of observation. They alter soil chemistry. They affect the distribution of plants that are sensitive to heavy metal concentrations. They create localized variations in magnetic field strength. They can influence the behavior of groundwater, creating unexpected springs or unexpected dry zones. They can, in some cases, produce gas emissions that affect the atmosphere at ground level. Every one of those effects is the kind of thing that a culture of meticulous environmental observers, accumulating observations across thousands of generations, would notice, encode, and transmit. Every one of those effects could form the basis for understanding why certain places behaved differently, why the ground was different, why the plants were different, why animals avoided certain areas or congregated in others. And every one of those effects could form the basis for the kind of protocols and prohibitions that Aboriginal custodians maintained around specific sites. Do not camp here. Do not eat what grows here. Do not take the water from this place without ceremony. Do not dig here. The researchers comparing the locations of the geophysical anomalies with the locations of sites maintained as restricted or significant by Aboriginal custodians have been, in the words of one of the project scientists, repeatedly surprised, not overwhelmed with a perfect correlation. This is real science, and real science deals in degrees of evidence, not in dramatic revelations. But surprised. The correspondence is significantly higher than chance would predict. Not all restricted sites correspond to geophysical anomalies, and not all geophysical anomalies correspond to restricted sites. The relationship is not deterministic, but it is consistent enough to be meaningful. And meaningful in a direction that changes the conversation about what Aboriginal oral tradition actually is. Not mythology. Not exclusively mythology. Not simply spiritual narrative about an imagined cosmological order, but at least in significant part, a repository of empirical observation about the physical world, maintained across timescales that dwarf the entirety of the Western scientific tradition, and organized in a format, the story, the ceremony, the song, that is extraordinarily well suited to long-term preservation. Now, it would be wrong to reduce Aboriginal oral tradition to a geological database. It is far more than that. It is a complete cosmological and ethical system. It describes not just what the world is, but what the world means. Not just how things are, but how they should be treated. Not just the physical structure of the land, but the relationships and responsibilities that bind living things to that land and to each other. The dreaming, which is the English translation of a concept that exists in various forms across all Aboriginal cultures, is not a mythology in the dismissive Western sense of that word. It is a description of the underlying order of reality, an order that includes but is not limited to the physical, the historical, and the relational dimensions of existence. The geological and ecological knowledge encoded in dreaming stories is not accidentally present in the stories. It is there because the dreaming is precisely the kind of system that would encode it, a system designed to capture and transmit everything that matters about the land and the right way of living within it. What the scientists who have begun engaging with this knowledge system most seriously are finding is that the dreaming is extraordinarily comprehensive. The things it knows about the land are not limited to what could be discovered by casual observation over a few generations. They reflect the accumulated observational product of thousands of generations of people who treated the careful knowing of their country as the central purpose and highest achievement of human life, because it was, for 65,000 years, knowing your country was the difference between life and death. Not knowing it was extinction. The culture that survived longest on this planet is the one that developed the most rigorous and the most comprehensive system for knowing and transmitting knowledge about the physical world. That is not a coincidence. And now we are at the point where this story gets even more complex. Because it is not only what the Aboriginal traditions know about the geology that is remarkable, it is what they know about the biology. The interior of the Australian continent is, by conventional ecological measures, one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth. Annual rainfall across much of the interior is less than 250 millimeters, which is the lower boundary of what is generally defined as desert. Summer temperatures regularly exceed 45 degrees Celsius. Winter nights can fall below freezing. The soil is ancient, deeply weathered, nutrient poor, and in many areas chemically hostile to the root systems of most plant species. And yet, for 65,000 years, people lived in it. They fed themselves from it, clothed themselves with it, built their dwellings from it, and maintained sufficient population numbers that they produced the continuous cultural tradition we are discussing. How did they do this? The answer involves ecological knowledge of a depth and precision that modern Western conservation biology is only beginning to approach with its instrumental and computational methods. Aboriginal groups across the interior maintained what is now called a mosaic burning regime, a systematic practice of burning the landscape in carefully timed and carefully located patches that maintained the diversity of the plant and animal communities in their territories. This was not random burning. It was not burning to clear ground for purposes of agriculture or development. It was burning to manage the ecological relationships that structured the living world of their country. The knowledge required to do this correctly is extraordinary in its complexity. You need to know what grows where and why. You need to know the successional dynamics of the plant communities in your territory. What comes in first after fire, what replaces it as the patch ages, what animals use each stage of that succession for food or shelter. You need to know the timing of reproductive cycles of the species you are managing so that you burn at the right time to protect the seed stock or the shelter that will be needed. You need to know how the burn patterns interact with rainfall distribution, with topography, with the underground water systems that determine where moisture is available in dry periods. All of this knowledge was, and in some communities still is, encoded in the songlines and the dreaming stories. The stories told you where to burn, when to burn, how to read the signs that told you when the burn was needed, and what to expect in the seasons after. This ecological management system had, over thousands of years, shaped the Australian interior in ways that are not always visible to the unschooled eye, but that become clear when you compare the state of managed country to unmanaged country. Managed country has more species diversity. It has more reliable food sources for both human and non-human communities. It has greater resilience in drought conditions. It retains moisture more effectively. It supports larger populations of the game animals that the human community depends on. The Australian government and conservation scientists spent much of the 20th century failing to manage the interior effectively using their own methods. Invasive species proliferated, native species declined, wildfire burned through unmanaged fuel loads in catastrophic events. The land was degrading in measurable, scientifically documented ways. And then, in the 1990s and 2000s, something began to shift. Indigenous ranger programs, established in partnership between Aboriginal communities and government agencies, began reintroducing traditional burning practices in various parts of the interior. The ecological results were measurable and significant. Biodiversity indicators improved. Wildfire frequency and severity declined in traditionally managed areas. Species that had been considered locally extinct began to reappear. The land responded to the knowledge that had been developed for it over 65,000 years. But here is the piece that most directly connects back to what lies beneath. The Aboriginal burning practices were not only managing the surface ecology, they were managing the underground ecology as well. That may sound strange. We do not typically think of fire management as having underground effects. But the relationship between surface burning regimes and subsurface biological and chemical processes is real, and it is increasingly well understood in soil science and ecology. Fire affects the soil chemistry in ways that persist for years after the visible effects have disappeared. It changes the pH. It alters the microbial communities that drive nutrient cycling. It affects the depth to which water penetrates during rain events. In deep-rooted plant communities, it changes what the roots are doing in the subsurface, which affects the physical structure of the soil at depth. Over thousands of years, across a landscape managed by an intricate and well-calibrated burning regime, the cumulative subsurface effects of that management are not trivial. They are part of what makes managed Aboriginal country different from unmanaged country, not just on the surface but below it. Aboriginal custodians, when asked about the effects of burning on country, do not only describe the surface effects, they describe the effects on the whole of country, including the underground world. The stories about what is beneath the ground are not separate from the stories about how to manage the surface. They are part of the same system of knowledge about the same place. The researchers who have begun to understand this have also begun to understand why the knowledge is so difficult to translate into Western scientific language. It is not that the knowledge is coded in a way designed to obscure it. It is that the knowledge is embedded in a framework, the dreaming, the songlines, the relational understanding of country, that is comprehensively integrated in ways that Western disciplinary science, with its division of geology from biology, from ecology, from history, from cosmology, cannot easily accommodate. To know what the Aranti know about the geology beneath the McDonnell Ranges, you have to know it in the context of everything else they know about the McDonnell Ranges. The geology is not a separate domain. It is one dimension of the whole knowing of country. Extracting it from that context and presenting it as information that a geologist can use in the way a geologist normally uses information is not straightforward. Something is always lost in the translation. But increasingly, what the best researchers in this field are arguing for is not translation but dialogue. Not the extraction of useful geological or ecological data points from Aboriginal tradition, but genuine collaborative inquiry, where Western scientific methods and Aboriginal knowledge systems work in parallel on the same questions about the same country. And when that dialogue happens, the results are sometimes extraordinary. In the Kimberley region of northwestern Australia, in the 2010s, a series of conversations between Australian elders and researchers from several Australian universities produced a body of collaborative research about the underground water systems of the region that neither side could have developed independently. The elders knew, from their oral traditions and from their own careful observation, where the water was. They knew which surface features corresponded to underground water sources. They knew which plant communities indicated the presence of water at depth. They knew the seasonal dynamics of the underground systems in ways that the hydrological surveys had not fully captured. The researchers brought their instruments, their computational models, their ability to date and quantify the features the elders were describing. What they found confirmed and extended, and in some cases corrected the hydrology they thought they understood. The underground water of the Kimberley is, it turns out, a more complex and more extensive system than the surveys conducted without Aboriginal input had suggested. There are connections between surface water bodies and underground storage systems that had not been mapped. There are recharge zones that the models had not correctly identified, and there are areas where the water is not where the models said it should be, but is exactly where the elders said it was. The practical implications are significant. Water management in a region subject to extreme seasonal variability is one of the most pressing challenges of living in the Australian interior. Knowing where the water is, really knowing, with the comprehensive, integrated knowledge of country that Aboriginal traditions encode, is life and death knowledge. It has been life and death knowledge for 65,000 years. And now, as the climate of the Australian interior undergoes changes, driven by the global atmospheric modifications of the industrial era, that knowledge may become more important, not less, than at any time in the period since European colonisation. The lakes of the interior are behaving differently than they were a century ago. The rainfall patterns are shifting, the temperature extremes are extending, the plant communities are changing in response to all of this. The underground water systems are responding to reduced recharge and increased evapotranspiration. The custodians of the land, the people whose culture has been tracking and responding to changes in this country since before the last ice age ended, are watching these changes happen. And they are saying what they see, in the same way their ancestors said what they saw. The country is changing. Some of the change is within the range of what has happened before. Some of it is different. That observation, coming from people who carry the longest baseline of environmental observation of any human community on Earth, is not mythology, it is data. The most long baseline environmental data we have for the Australian interior is in the oral traditions of its Aboriginal custodians, and it is being lost at a rate that mirrors the loss of the languages in which it is encoded, faster than it can be documented or preserved in forms that the broader world can access. The urgency of that loss, the loss of 65,000 years of accumulated environmental observation about one of the most complex and least understood ecosystems on Earth, is something that researchers in this field describe in terms that go beyond professional concern. One geologist, reflecting on a conversation with an elder in the Northern Territory who had agreed to share some of what his tradition knew about the ground beneath their feet in a particular area, described the experience afterward as sitting in front of a library that was on fire. Not a metaphorical fire. A real process of loss, driven by the death of elders, by the disruption of the transmission systems that carry traditional knowledge from generation to generation, by the economic and social pressures that make it increasingly difficult for young people to undertake the years of learning required to receive the deep knowledge. The library is on fire, and most of the world is not paying attention, but some people are, and the story of what they have found, when they paid attention, when they sat down and listened without immediately trying to fit what they heard into existing frameworks, is the story that runs through everything we have been discussing. Now let us go deeper still, because there is another dimension to this that we have not yet addressed, and it takes us out of the realm of what is comfortably within the bounds of mainstream science, and into territory that is more contested, more speculative, but no less fascinating. Among the restricted and deeply guarded knowledge traditions of some Aboriginal groups, there are accounts that describe events of a kind that Western science has no framework for. Not all of these accounts lend themselves to the kind of geological or ecological analysis we have been discussing. Some of them describe things that, on their face, do not correspond to any known physical phenomenon, things beneath the ground that are not rock and not water and not ore. Presences, intelligences, things that were there before the people arrived and that have been there since. It would be easy to dismiss these as the purely spiritual and cosmological dimension of the dreaming, the part that has no correspondence to empirical physical reality and should not be expected to. The dreaming is a complete cosmological system. It includes both the physical world and the world of meaning and relationship and spiritual reality. Not every element of it is intended as a description of measurable physical phenomena, but some of the researchers who have spent years working with Aboriginal knowledge systems in good faith and deep engagement have come to a more careful position. They say, we should not be quick to decide which parts of the knowledge have physical correlates and which do not. We have already been wrong too many times about that. We thought the stories about coastal flooding were mythology. They were geography. We thought the stories about fire from the sky were mythologized fear of natural events. They were impact records. We thought the stories about what the ground knows were spiritual belief. they turned out to encode real information about real geology. Before we decide that the stories about presences beneath the ground have no physical dimension, perhaps we should look more carefully at what is beneath the ground. This is not a suggestion that there are literal supernatural beings living under the outback. It is a suggestion that we maintain appropriate epistemic humility about a knowledge system that has been right in ways we did not expect, more times and in more categories than we initially thought possible. The chambers that the geophysical surveys are revealing, the low-density anomalies at depth, the features that the geologists are cautiously describing as void-like structures, what is in them? The surveys tell us they are there. They do not yet tell us precisely what they contain. The next phase of research, involving deep drilling and more detailed seismic analysis, is aimed at beginning to answer that question. And when those answers come, researchers who are aware of what the Aboriginal traditions say about the ground beneath specific locations may find themselves in the same position that their colleagues in coastal geography and in impact geology and in mineral exploration have found themselves in, looking at what the data shows and hearing in the back of their minds the voice of an elder who already knew. There is one more thread in this story. One that connects the Australian material to a broader global pattern that is itself one of the most interesting and under-discussed topics in the study of ancient cultures. Australia is not the only place where Indigenous oral traditions have been found to contain accurate information about subsurface or long-period geological events. It is the place where the evidence is most thoroughly documented, because of the antiquity of the culture and the particular attention that a small number of dedicated researchers have brought to it. But similar patterns have been identified elsewhere. In North America, the oral traditions of numerous First Nations carry descriptions of geological events, volcanic eruptions, massive floods, dramatic landscape transformations, that correspond to events in the geological record at timescales that range from centuries to thousands of years. The oral traditions of the Pacific Northwest contain detailed accounts of Cascadia subduction zone earthquakes and the tsunamis they generated, accounts that match the sedimentary record of those events with a specificity that cannot be coincidental. In New Zealand, Maori oral traditions contain accounts of the Taupo supervolcanic eruptions that are detailed enough to have assisted geologists in reconstructing the timing and character of those events. In Iceland, the sagas contain embedded geological information about the behavior of the volcanic landscape that geologists have found useful in understanding eruption patterns. In India, the oral traditions of Gondwana tribals contain descriptions of landscape features and events that correspond to geological reality across timescales of thousands of years. The pattern is global. Ancient oral cultures, particularly those that maintained deep and continuous connections to specific territories across very long periods, developed robust mechanisms for preserving accurate empirical information about those territories, encoded in forms that could survive the transmission process across many generations. This is not mystical. It is practical. It is what you would expect from cultures whose survival depended absolutely on accurate knowledge of their physical environment. The surprise is not that they preserved the knowledge. The surprise is that we, with all our instruments and our databases and our institutions, were so quick to assume they had not. The implications of taking this seriously are significant, not just for the specific scientific questions about what is beneath the Australian outback, though those questions are fascinating, and their answers will tell us things about the deep history of the continent that cannot be accessed any other way. The implications extend to how we think about knowledge, about what counts as evidence, about the relationship between different traditions of knowing the world. Western science has been the dominant knowledge system for the last 4 centuries. Its achievements are real and extraordinary. It has given us quantum mechanics and genomics and the ability to send instruments to the surface of other planets. But it has also, in its dominance, crowded out other ways of knowing the world that have their own validity and their own accumulated depth. The conversation that is now beginning in Australia and elsewhere between Indigenous knowledge systems and Western scientific methods is not a conversation in which one tradition teaches the other. It is a conversation between equals, or between systems that have their own deep competences and their own genuine limitations. Both sides have things to learn. Both sides have things to contribute. And the world, which faces genuine crises that Western science alone has not been able to solve, may have much to gain from the knowledge that has been sitting in plain sight in the stories of the oldest cultures on Earth. The elders warned about what lies beneath the outback. They warned for 50,000 years. The scientists looked, and what they found made them listen. The outback does not give up its secrets easily. It never has. The land that stretches from the red plains of Central Australia out to the salt flats and the ancient ranges has been keeping its deep history since before the first human foot ever pressed into its dust. It is patient in a way that no human institution can be. It has all the time that geological and biological reality allots, which is to say, more time than we can meaningfully contemplate. The Aboriginal custodians of that land understood its patience. They understood, in a way that the colonial encounter disrupted, and that the scientific establishment is only now beginning to recover the capacity to appreciate that knowledge of a place is not a thing that can be assembled quickly. It is not a thing that can be extracted by a survey, however sophisticated the instruments. It is built across generations, maintained through relationship, transmitted through ceremony and story, and deepened by the continuous practice of paying attention. 65,000 years of paying attention. That is what the geophysical surveys are now beginning to find the traces of, not in the stories themselves, which the instruments cannot read, but in the reality beneath the surface, the reality that the stories describe. The ground beneath the outback is not what it appears to be from the surface. It is complex, layered, ancient, beyond meaningful human comparison, and in some locations genuinely strange in ways that the best available science is still working to characterize. The elders knew something was down there. They knew it required respect, required protocols, required the kind of careful, long-term relationship that their culture had been built to maintain. They may not have known what it was in the terms that a 21st century geologist would use to describe it, but they knew it was there. They knew it mattered. And they preserved that knowledge across more generations than any other knowledge tradition on Earth has managed to preserve anything. When the scientists finally looked, they found what the elders had been pointing to. The question now is what we do with that fact. Whether we treat it as a curiosity, an interesting data point in the ongoing study of how Indigenous knowledge systems relate to scientific knowledge systems, or whether we treat it as what it actually is. A fundamental challenge to our assumptions about what knowledge is, where it lives, how long it can survive, and what it means when the oldest wisdom traditions on Earth tell us that the ground beneath our feet is different from what we think it is. The surveys are ongoing, the drilling programs are beginning, the conversations between researchers and custodians are deepening. The answers to what specifically lies in those subsurface structures, those chambers, those density anomalies, those void-like features identified in the geophysical data, those answers are coming. When they come, they may well confirm what the elders have been saying all along, or they may reveal something that none of the existing frameworks, either the Western scientific or the Aboriginal traditional, have fully anticipated. The Australian interior is the oldest piece of inhabited continent on Earth. It has been hosting human consciousness for at least 65,000 years. 65,000 years of looking, listening, learning, encoding, transmitting, singing, dreaming. The ground remembers what the people have remembered about the ground. Whatever is down there has been waiting, in the patience of rock and deep time, for us to develop the instruments to find it. And the people who knew it was there, who warned that it was there, who built their entire relationship with their country around the fact that something lay beneath the visible surface that demanded acknowledgement and respect, those people have been waiting even longer. They have been waiting, in a sense, for the conversation that is now beginning. The conversation in which what they know is not dismissed as mythology, but engaged with as what it is, knowledge. The deepest, longest preserved, most carefully maintained knowledge of place that any human culture has ever produced. The scientists looked. What they found was not a simple thing. It never is. When you look at something that has been carefully tended and guarded for 65,000 years, it is, in the end, the land itself speaking. Speaking in a language that the instruments can translate into data and that the stories have been translating into meaning since before the Ice Age ended. What lies beneath the outback is part of the story of the continent, and the people who know that story, who have always known that story, have been telling it all along, to anyone willing to listen. Listen. The ground is speaking. It has always been speaking. We are only now learning how to hear. There is another level to this that we need to sit with before we can call this story anywhere close to complete. Because what we have covered so far is the story of knowledge. Knowledge about rock, about water, about fire from the sky, about the ecological web of a continent. But there is another conversation happening in the research literature and in the private discussions between researchers and custodians that goes beyond knowledge about physical things. It is the conversation about the dreaming itself. About what, exactly, the dreaming is a description of. Western interpreters have been trying to categorize the dreaming since the first serious ethnographic accounts were produced in the late 19th century. It is a creation mythology, some said, a religious system, a philosophical framework, a cosmological narrative. All of these descriptions are true in their way, but all of them are insufficient in their way because they try to fit the dreaming into categories that pre-exist the encounter with it. The Aboriginal scholars and knowledge custodians who have been willing to discuss the dreaming in dialogue with Western thinkers have consistently made a point that Western interpreters consistently struggle to fully absorb. The dreaming is not a story about how things were made in the past. It is a description of how things are. The dreaming is not a past event. It is a present reality. The ancestors who moved across the land in the dreaming, the beings who shaped the country and established its relationships and encoded its laws, they did not finish their work and then cease to exist. They are still present. They are present in the land itself, in the waterholes and the rocky outcrops and the particular configuration of the hills, in the plants and the animals, in the ceremonies that maintain the connection between the living people and the living country. This is not metaphor. When a Pitjantjatjara elder says that the malu, the red kangaroo, carries the dreaming of a particular ancestor, they are not saying that the kangaroo is a symbol of an ancestor. They are saying that the kangaroo is a manifestation of a reality that the ancestor established, and that the kangaroo is therefore connected to all the other things that ancestor established, including the geographic features of the ancestor's path across the country, the laws that govern the relationships between the people and those features, and the ceremonies required to maintain those relationships. This is a description of a real and continuous relationship between consciousness, culture, and country. It is not mythology in the sense of a story that may or may not be literally true. It is an account of a mode of being in the world that Western culture, with its sharp distinctions between the human and the natural, the physical and the spiritual, the past and the present, does not have good language for. Some Western thinkers who have spent long enough in genuine dialogue with Aboriginal knowledge custodians have come to believe that the dreaming is not only an account of the Aboriginal people's relationship with their country, it is an account of a feature of reality that the Aboriginal peoples happen to develop a precise and comprehensive system for working with, a feature that other cultures have intuited or partially described, but that no other culture has mapped with the same systematic completeness. The feature is this, that consciousness and physical reality are not separate things, that they are aspects of a single reality that has both dimensions present everywhere and always. That the land is not merely a physical substrate on which conscious beings move and act, but is itself a participant in a larger relational reality in which the physical and the conscious are continuously interpenetrating. This is not physics. It is not biology. It is not geology. It is something that stands beside all of those disciplines, and that none of them can fully accommodate without revising their foundational assumptions. But it is consistent with the evidence. Not proven by the evidence, but consistent with it, because what the evidence says, the totality of the converging lines of evidence about Aboriginal knowledge and its relationship to physical reality, is that the dreaming is a system that works. That when you engage with country in the way the dreaming prescribes, the land flourishes. That when you maintain the ceremonies that the dreaming requires, the knowledge is preserved across time scales that no other system of knowledge preservation has achieved. That when you pay attention to what the dreaming says about the land, including what it says is beneath the land, you find that it is pointing to things that are really there. A system that consistently works across 65,000 years in the domain of accurately knowing and correctly managing a complex and demanding physical environment is a system that deserves to be taken seriously, not just as a historical and cultural artifact, but as a living knowledge tradition that may have things to teach that cannot be found anywhere else. The researchers who are beginning to learn this, who are sitting with elders and listening without the reflexive impulse to translate what they hear into familiar categories, are finding that the edge of their understanding keeps moving. That every time they think they have grasped what it is that the dreaming knows, they discover that there is another layer beneath that understanding, another depth to the knowing that they have not yet found a way to access. The ground has layers. The knowledge has layers. And the relationship between the two is itself layered in ways that may take another generation of careful and humble inquiry to begin to map. What lies beneath the outback? The geophysicists are working on the physical answer to that question, and what they are finding is already remarkable. Chambers and voids and density anomalies, and the traces of events that happened millions and in some cases billions of years ago, events whose effects have been persisting in the deep structure of the oldest stable continental craton on Earth, waiting for instruments sophisticated enough to detect them. But beneath the physical answer is another answer, an answer about what it means to know something, about what the relationship between human consciousness and the physical world can be when it is nurtured across sufficient time, about what a culture becomes when its central project, its deepest value, its highest achievement, is not conquest or accumulation or technological power, but knowing. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia have been knowing their country for 65,000 years. They have been knowing it with a depth and a comprehensiveness and a duration that no other culture has matched. And what the evidence increasingly suggests is that their knowing is real, that it corresponds to reality, that when they say something is beneath the ground, something is beneath the ground. That when they say the land is alive with a presence that demands respect, there is a physical reality that underlies that statement, even if the language in which it is made does not map onto the categories of Western physical science. The scientists looked, the elders knew. The ground is speaking. What we do with that knowledge, whether we treat it with the respect it has earned across 65,000 years of continuous validation, or whether we extract what is useful and discard the rest, or whether we choose to enter into a genuine dialogue that might change both what we know and how we know it, that choice belongs to us. The elders have been patient for a very long time. The ground has been patient longer still. Neither is likely to run out of patience on our account, but the opportunity to listen, the chance to access the deepest accumulated knowledge of place that any human culture has ever produced, that is not permanent. The languages die, the elders pass, the transmission chains break. The library that has been burning for 2 centuries is not burning slower. The question is not what lies beneath the outback. The question is whether we will understand what has been above it, what has been standing on it, and knowing it, and singing it, and dreaming it, for 65,000 years, before that understanding becomes impossible. 65,000 years of eyes open to the land. 65,000 years of listening to what the earth says. 65,000 years of encoding everything observed into the most durable storage medium ever developed by human culture, the living voice, passing from one living person to another in a chain that has not broken since before the last ice age. That is what lies above the outback. And what that culture knows about what lies beneath it may be the most important environmental knowledge that this planet's most endangered ecosystem has access to. We should listen. Before we cannot. The country is speaking. It has always been speaking. Are we ready to hear? What was found when the instruments were turned toward the deep earth of the Australian interior is only the beginning of an investigation that will take decades. What has already been found is enough to establish something important. The convergence between what Aboriginal knowledge traditions describe and what modern geophysical methods reveal is real. It is documented. It is repeatable. And it is expanding with every survey, every conversation, every careful and respectful collaboration between custodians of the land and custodians of the instruments. The story is not complete. Stories of this depth are never complete. They are always in the middle of their own telling. The land is still being known. The knowledge is still being transmitted in the communities where the transmission has not been broken. The instruments are still mapping. The data is still being processed and interpreted and compared. But the direction is clear. What the elders warned about is real. What they knew is real. The knowledge encoded in 65,000 years of continuous human engagement with the oldest inhabited continent on Earth is a kind of knowing that the world cannot afford to lose. And the fact that we are only now beginning to understand its depth, only now developing the capacity to take it seriously in the terms that it deserves, is both a tragedy and an opportunity. A tragedy because of how much has already been lost. How many language groups have gone silent? How many transmission chains have been broken? How many elders have carried their deepest knowledge to the grave without anyone prepared to receive it? The loss is real, and it is ongoing, and it cannot be undone. An opportunity because of what remains, because there are still custodians who carry the knowledge, because there are still researchers willing to listen, because there are still collaborations being built that might preserve something of what has survived the colonial encounter, might deepen our understanding of what it means and what it is, and might open the possibility of a genuine dialogue between the oldest, continuously maintained knowledge tradition on Earth and the newest and most powerful methods for investigating physical reality. Beneath the outback, the ground holds its secrets in the patient language of stone and pressure and time. Above it, the culture that has known those secrets for 65,000 years continues its long conversation with the land. The scientists looked. What they found was the beginning of understanding what the elders already knew. The warning was real. The knowledge was real. The ground beneath the outback is real. And the people who have known it, tended it, sung it, and dreamed it since before any other culture on Earth was recording its own name, those people are still here, still knowing, still speaking, still waiting for the world to listen. There are places on this Earth that refuse to be fully explained, places that sit at the intersection of what we measure and what we feel, between the world that instruments can map and the world that experience insists is present but cannot be captured in data. The Australian Outback is one of those places. It has always been one of those places. The people who have lived there longest know this. They have known it since before the category of inexplicable was available to them, since before the concept of the supernatural had been separated from the concept of the natural by the philosophies that would eventually produce Western science. For the Aboriginal peoples of Australia, there was no distinction between the world that could be measured and the world that could be felt. Both were dimensions of the same country. Both demanded the same quality of attention. That attention is what produced the knowledge we have been discussing. And it is that attention that the modern world is only now learning to recognize as what it is, the most comprehensive and most carefully maintained environmental knowledge tradition in human history. But we need to go further. Because the story of what lies beneath the outback is not only a story about mineral deposits and geophysical anomalies and the impressive geological memory of oral traditions, it is also a story about time, about what it means to exist in time in the way that the Aboriginal cultures of Australia have existed in time. Western culture has a linear relationship with time. History moves forward. The past is behind us. The future is ahead. Events happen, and then they are over. And they recede into the past where they become the objects of historical inquiry rather than living presences. The dreaming has a different relationship with time, not because Aboriginal peoples are somehow pre-modern or pre-logical, not because they fail to understand causality or sequence, but because the cosmological system they developed over 65,000 years encodes a different and more complete understanding of how time actually works, an understanding that in some respects is closer to what modern physics has discovered about the nature of time than it is to the common-sense Western notion. The dreaming is not a past time. It is not a creation era that preceded the present. It is an eternal dimension of reality that is always present, always accessible, always acting on the present world. The events of the dreaming, the movements of the ancestors, the shaping of the land, the establishment of the laws that govern relationships between all things, these did not happen and then stop. They continue, they are ongoing, they are as present in the landscape now as they were when they first occurred. The features of the landscape that were shaped by the ancestors in the dreaming are not relics of a past event. They are the ongoing expression of that event, still being enacted in the present, still requiring the ceremonies and relationships that maintain them. This has implications for how we understand the information encoded in the dreaming about what lies beneath the ground. When an elder describes what is beneath a particular part of the country, they are not necessarily describing something that happened in the past and left a trace. They may be describing something that is present and active in the present, something that is still shaping the country above it, still affecting the living things on the surface, still participating in the relational reality of that part of the land. The geophysical anomalies that the surveys are finding beneath the outback are not simply static features of deep geological history. They are active features of the current state of the continental crust. The density differences, the compositional variations, the void spaces and chambers, these are real features of the current physical reality beneath the surface. They affect the movement of groundwater through the crust. They affect the thermal state of the rock above them. They affect the geomagnetic field at the surface. They affect, in ways that are subtle but real, the surface world. The Aboriginal knowledge about these features is not only knowledge about what was in the geological past, it is knowledge about what is in the geological present. Knowledge about how these features are currently affecting the land, how they relate to the living ecology of the surface, how they fit into the relational reality of country that the dreaming describes. This is, from the perspective of Western science, an extraordinary thing. It means that the knowledge preserved in the oral traditions is not only a record of past observations, it is a continuously updated understanding of the current state of the land, maintained through the ongoing practice of the ceremonies and relationships and careful attentiveness that the dreaming prescribes. The knowledge is alive. It is not a library of past observations. It is a living engagement with a living land, and the land is responding. When researchers have worked collaboratively with Aboriginal custodians on questions about specific features of the landscape, they have found repeatedly that the custodians are not only describing what the feature is like, but what it is doing. What it is currently doing in the present. How it is currently relating to the water and the plants and the animals and the people. What the appropriate engagement with it currently requires. This is not memory. Or rather, it is not only memory in the sense in which Western culture uses that term as a record of past experiences stored in an individual or collective mind. It is something that combines memory with ongoing observation, ongoing relationship, ongoing dialogue with the land. The elders are not simply recalling what their grandparents told them. They are integrating what their grandparents told them with what they themselves have observed, with what the land is currently showing them, with what the ceremonies are currently maintaining and revealing. The knowledge is continuously being enriched by new observation and new experience, even as its deep structure, the understanding of what the country is and how it works, remains stable across generations. This combination of depth and continuity is what makes Aboriginal environmental knowledge unique. And it is what makes it so difficult to fully access through conventional research methods that expect knowledge to be bounded, documented, and transferable independently of the relational context in which it was developed. You cannot extract the geological knowledge from the ceremony. You cannot separate the ecological knowledge from the relationships of responsibility that give it meaning. You cannot access the full depth of the understanding of what lies beneath the outback without entering, at least to some degree, into the world of the dreaming in which that understanding is embedded. And that is a world that takes time to understand. Not just intellectual time, experiential time. Time spent in the country, time spent in relationship with the custodians of that country, time spent attending to the country with the kind of disciplined and comprehensive attention that the tradition cultivates. The researchers who have gone furthest in developing genuine understanding of what Aboriginal knowledge traditions know about the land are the ones who have spent the most time in that engagement. Not weeks, not months, years, Decades. Long enough to begin to learn the language of the country, both the human language in which the knowledge is transmitted and the more than human language of the land itself, the language of behavior and pattern and relationship that reveals itself only to sustained and humble attention. Those researchers report that the experience changes how you think, not in a mystical or unscientific way, in a more fundamental way. It changes what questions you ask, it changes what you notice, it changes your understanding of what counts as evidence and what counts as knowledge. Several have described the experience of coming to understand, really understand, that the land is not a passive substrate on which knowledge is gathered. The land participates in its own knowing. It reveals itself to those who approach it in the right relationship. It withholds itself from those who do not. This sounds, to ears trained by Western scientific epistemology, like animism, like the projection of human consciousness onto non-human reality, like the kind of thinking that the scientific method was explicitly designed to overcome. But the researchers who are saying it are not abandoning the scientific method, they are observing something. They are reporting that, empirically, in their experience, the land seems to respond to how it is approached. That data from surveys conducted in partnership with Aboriginal custodians, conducted in the appropriate relational context, with the appropriate protocols of engagement, produces results that differ from data gathered without that context. This is not a claim that the instruments behave differently. The magnetometer reads what the magnetometer reads. The electromagnetic survey maps what is beneath the surface, without regard for the intentions of the people conducting it. But what the people conducting it understand about what they are finding, the questions they know to ask, the features they know to attend to, the interpretation they bring to the raw data, all of this is affected by the quality of the relationship with the country and its custodians that has preceded and surrounds the technical work. In one of the most striking examples of this, a geological survey of a site in the Northern Territory in the early 2010s produced data that the researchers initially interpreted as indicating a mineralogical feature of moderate economic interest. The feature was logged, noted, and the survey moved on. A few years later, when a researcher working in collaboration with the Aliawar custodians of that country revisited the data in the context of what the Aliawar knew about that specific location, the interpretation shifted. The feature was not what the initial interpretation had suggested. Understanding what the Aliawar knew about the character of that part of their country, what the dreaming said about what was there and how it behaved, allowed the researchers to see the data differently. A second survey, informed by this understanding, revealed that the original feature was part of a much larger structure that the initial interpretation had missed. The knowledge changed what the instruments found, not by altering the physical reality, by changing the understanding that made it possible to see what was already there to be seen. This is not magic, this is epistemology. This is what happens when you bring a richer understanding to a dataset. The data does not change. The understanding of what it means changes. And in this case, the richer understanding came from a knowledge tradition that had been attending to that specific country for tens of thousands of years. There are things beneath the Australian Outback that Western science is only beginning to find. There are things beneath it that Western science has not yet developed the questions for. And there are things beneath it that the people who have known that country for 65,000 years know, and that they may or may not choose to share, depending on whether the relationship that makes sharing appropriate has been established. The establishment of that relationship is not quick. It is not guaranteed. It requires the kind of patience and humility and sustained commitment that the academic and industrial systems of the West are not designed to maintain, but the effort is underway. In multiple places, in multiple collaborations, in multiple forms. And the results, where they are emerging, are changing what we know about the oldest inhabited continent on Earth and about the nature of knowledge itself. Let us turn now to something more specific, something that allows us to ground this large picture story in the particular. In 2019, a team of researchers from the University of Melbourne and the Australian National University published a paper that drew considerable attention within the geological and anthropological communities, though it did not make the mainstream news in the way it perhaps deserved to. The paper described the results of a 5-year collaborative study with Aranda and Aliawa knowledge custodians in the eastern MacDonnell Ranges of the Northern Territory. The study had 2 parallel streams: a comprehensive geophysical survey of the subsurface structure of a particular valley system and a detailed documentation, in partnership with the custodians, of what the dreaming knowledge held about that valley and the ground beneath it. The geophysical stream produced detailed maps of the subsurface structure using a combination of airborne electromagnetic surveys, ground-penetrating radar at various depths, and seismic reflection data. The maps revealed a subsurface geology of considerable complexity, multiple distinct layers of rock with different compositions, intruded by bodies of material with anomalous geochemical signatures, and, in 2 locations within the survey area, features that match the characteristics of the low-density anomalies that had been appearing in other surveys. Void-like structures at depths of several hundred meters, with dimensions of several hundred meters to potentially over a kilometer in their largest extent. The knowledge stream documented what the Aranda and Aliawa custodians were willing to share about the valley. This was a carefully negotiated process. Not everything known about the country could be shared in a research context, and the custodians maintained their authority over what was and was not appropriate to discuss. But within those boundaries, they shared enough for the researchers to attempt a comparison. The comparison produced results that the researchers described as striking, and that they were careful to present in language that was precise and circumspect, because the implications were significant, and they did not want to overstate them. The locations within the valley that the Aranda and Aliawa knowledge identified as places of particular significance, places requiring specific protocols of approach and engagement, places that the dreaming said were different from the surrounding country in ways that demanded respect. These locations corresponded closely to the locations of the subsurface anomalies revealed by the geophysical survey. This was not a perfect one-to-one correspondence. There were significant sites in the knowledge tradition that did not correspond to identified geophysical anomalies. And there were geophysical anomalies that did not correspond to sites marked as significant in the knowledge tradition. The relationship was not deterministic, but the statistical correspondence was well above chance, and in the cases where significant sites and geophysical anomalies did correspond, the degree of correspondence, in terms of the character that the knowledge attributed to the site and the character that the geophysical data revealed of the subsurface feature, was, in the words of one of the lead researchers, hard to dismiss. The sites that the knowledge tradition described as particularly powerful, as places where the country was especially alive, especially demanding, especially requiring of careful relationship, tended to be the sites where the geophysical data showed the most dramatic subsurface features, the largest anomalies, the most complex structures, the features most unlike the surrounding geology. And the sites that the knowledge tradition described in terms of what came from beneath, the language varied and was carefully translated and interpreted, but the consistent thread was a sense of something rising, something present beneath the surface that was making itself felt in the world above. Those sites tended to coincide with the features that the geophysicists were most interested in: the void-like structures, the low-density anomalies, the places where something was different about the material at depth in ways that the models had not fully predicted. The paper was careful not to claim that the Aboriginal knowledge tradition had detected these specific geological features in any direct or instrumentally mediated sense. The knowledge tradition does not work by direct detection of geological anomalies. It works by the accumulated observation of the effects that those anomalies have on the surface world, over timescales long enough that even slow and subtle effects become perceptible and significant. Over 65,000 years, if a particular location has consistently shown unusual behavior in terms of the plant communities that establish themselves there, the animal behavior in the vicinity, the way water moves or does not move, the way the earth itself responds to fire and flood, a culture of meticulous environmental observers would encode that unusual character in its knowledge tradition. The location would be marked, described, attended to, and the description would be refined by each generation's additional observations. The result, after 65,000 years, would be a knowledge tradition that, without ever having directly detected the geological anomaly beneath the surface, accurately identified the locations of those anomalies through their effects on the surface world. This is observation science. It is empirical in the most fundamental sense. It is the accumulation of evidence, systematically encoded and transmitted about the state of the physical world. The fact that it is encoded in story rather than database, transmitted through ceremony rather than publication, maintained through relationship rather than institution, does not make it less scientific. It makes it different. It makes it older. It makes it, in terms of the sheer volume of observational data it encodes, more comprehensive than anything else we have. The paper also noted something that the researchers found particularly thought-provoking. The sites that the knowledge tradition described as places where great care was required, places where the country was powerful in ways that could be harmful if approached without the appropriate relationship and protocols. These sites included some of the locations where the geophysical data suggested the most unusual subsurface features. The researchers did not speculate about what might connect unusual subsurface geology to the kind of danger that requires careful protocol. They noted the correspondence and left it for further investigation, but the implication is present in the data. Whatever is in those subsurface chambers, whatever is contained in those low-density anomalies at depth beneath the outback, it has been affecting the surface world in ways that the people who lived on the surface noticed. And what they noticed was not neutral. What they noticed was powerful. Powerful in ways that required respect, required protocol, required the kind of careful, ongoing relationship that distinguishes a custodian of country from a visitor to it. The land beneath the outback is not just different, it is powerful. And the knowledge of how to be in right relationship with that power has been maintained in the stories and the ceremonies and the living practice of the people who belong to that country for 65,000 years. Now let us talk about what happens when that maintenance fails, when the transmission breaks, when the knowledge is lost, because that story is also part of what lies beneath the outback. It is part of the story that the land itself carries, in the accumulated changes of the last 200 years since the colonial encounter began. The disruption of Aboriginal culture by the colonial project in Australia was profound and in many respects catastrophic. The mechanisms were various: dispossession of land, which broke the relationship between people and country; the forced removal of children from families and communities, which severed the transmission of knowledge between generations; the prohibition of language, ceremony, and cultural practice, which disrupted the information storage and retrieval systems of the tradition; the deliberate destruction of sacred sites, which damaged the country itself in ways that the knowledge tradition could no longer respond to as it was designed to. The knowledge was not destroyed. It has never been fully destroyed. What survived with extraordinary tenacity, in the memories of elders who held it against every pressure to abandon it, in the deep, rural and remote communities where the disruption was less complete, in the cultural renaissance that has been gathering momentum since the 1970s, as Aboriginal communities have fought for and begun to recover their rights to their country and their culture. But much was lost. Languages died. Elders died carrying knowledge that had never been transmitted. Ceremonies fell out of practice, and with them the structures that maintained the specific knowledge they encoded. Country was damaged, mined, changed in ways that the knowledge described but could no longer protect. And when the knowledge is lost, the country suffers. This is not a metaphor. The country suffers in measurable, physical ways when the knowledge that maintained it is disrupted. The ecological degradation of the Australian interior in the period since European colonisation is one of the most comprehensively documented environmental disasters in the history of the inhabited world. Species extinctions, landscape degradation, soil loss, groundwater depletion, invasive species explosion, catastrophic wildfire, all of these have occurred at rates and scales that had no precedent in the previous 65,000 years of human occupation of the continent. The conventional explanation is straightforward: European pastoralism, agriculture, and resource extraction imposed on a landscape that had evolved in the absence of the animals and practices that characterized European land use. The sheep overgrazed the fragile soils. The cattle destroyed the riverbanks and the water table. The invasive plants and animals outcompeted and drove out the native species that the Aboriginal burning regime had maintained in balance. All of this is true, but it is not the complete picture. Because alongside the direct ecological damage of European land use came the disruption of the knowledge and practice system that had been maintaining the ecological integrity of the continent for 65,000 years. The burning regime was disrupted. The management of water sources was disrupted. The detailed species-specific ecological knowledge that had guided sustainable use of the landscape for thousands of generations was suppressed, lost, or rendered impossible to practice. The country did not just lose its managers. It lost the knowledge of how to be managed. The accumulated wisdom of 65,000 years of caring for a specific place was forced out of the world, replaced by agricultural and pastoral practices developed in a different hemisphere for different soils and different climates and different ecological relationships. The result is the environmental crisis of the Australian interior, and the recognition that has been growing, slowly, in some parts of the government and conservation science communities is that the path back from that crisis runs through the knowledge that was disrupted. Not exclusively. The ecological damage is real, and requires real ecological intervention. Invasive species management, revegetation, water table restoration, all of these require the tools of modern conservation science. But they also require the knowledge of what the country looked like, what it was supposed to be, what the right relationships between its components were, and that knowledge lives in the oral traditions of the Aboriginal custodians of the land. The country-based ranger programs that have been operating in various parts of Australia since the 1990s represent the practical implementation of this recognition. Aboriginal rangers, working on their own country, applying their traditional ecological knowledge in partnership with the tools of modern conservation science, have produced measurable and significant improvements in ecological condition in the areas where they operate. The knowledge works, not in theory, in practice. On the ground, in the country, in the actual measurable state of the ecological systems that the knowledge was developed to maintain. And beneath those ecological systems, in the geological and hydrological foundations of the land, the knowledge also applies. The underground water that the rangers manage is the water that the dreaming described. The soil chemistry that the burning practices affect is the soil chemistry that the stories encoded. The subsurface features that the geophysical surveys are revealing are the features that the restricted knowledge traditions know about and maintain protocols around. The knowledge is a system. You cannot fully apply one part of it without the rest. You cannot manage the surface ecology without understanding the subsurface systems that support it. You cannot manage the subsurface systems without understanding the surface ecology that interacts with them. You cannot understand either without the cosmological framework that holds them in relationship, that tells you what they mean and how they fit together, and what is required to maintain the integrity of the whole. The dreaming is not mythology. It is an operating manual for the Australian continent, and the people who hold it, the custodians who carry the knowledge and maintain the practice, are not relics of a pre-scientific age. They are the keepers of the most comprehensive ecological operating manual that any inhabited landscape has ever produced. We are losing them. The elders die. The languages fall silent. The ceremonies dwindle. The transmission breaks. The library burns. And beneath the red plains of the interior, in the chambers and the voids and the anomalous features that the instruments are beginning to map, whatever has been waiting down there in the patience of deep geological time, it keeps waiting. The land waits. The knowledge, what survives of it, waits. The instruments keep mapping. The conversations keep deepening, in the places where they can. And the story of what lies beneath the outback keeps unfolding. Among the most remarkable aspects of the recent convergences between Aboriginal knowledge and modern geophysical science is what they suggest about the nature of attention itself. About what human consciousness can achieve when it is applied with sufficient consistency and depth over sufficient time, to a sufficient degree of specificity. We are accustomed to thinking of knowledge as something that grows through the accumulation of new information. The scientific method is designed to generate new information through experiment and observation, to add to the body of knowledge by discovering things that were not previously known. Each generation builds on the knowledge of the previous generation by extending it, refining it, correcting its errors, adding new domains. This is a linear model of knowledge growth, and it is an extremely powerful model. It has produced the accumulation of scientific understanding that defines modernity. But the Aboriginal model of knowledge growth is not primarily linear. It is not primarily accumulative in the sense of constantly adding new domains. It is deepening. Each generation does not primarily extend the scope of knowledge to new areas. It deepens the understanding of what has already been known about specific areas. It refines the relationship with specific country, specific features, specific entities. It adds another layer of observation, another generation of experience to the existing understanding. Over 65,000 years, this deepening produces something qualitatively different from what the linear model produces. It produces a knowledge of depth and specificity that no amount of rapid horizontal accumulation can match. Not better knowledge, in some absolute sense. Different knowledge. Knowledge that goes down rather than out. Knowledge that goes further into the particular rather than further across the general. The knowledge of the geology beneath a specific site in the McDonnell Ranges, after 65,000 years of observation of that specific site, is not the same as the knowledge produced by a 3-month geophysical survey of the same site. The survey covers more physical parameters at higher resolution in more reproducible ways. The traditional knowledge covers the site in relationship, in time, in its full ecological and cosmological context, in ways that the survey cannot approach. Both kinds of knowledge are real. Both are valuable. Neither is complete without the other. The researchers who are beginning to work with both simultaneously are finding that the combination produces something that neither could produce alone. The survey data reveals features that the traditional knowledge could not describe in the language of geophysics. The traditional knowledge reveals significance and context that the survey data could not generate on its own. Together, they produce an understanding of specific places that is richer, more complete, and more practically useful than either alone. This is what genuine collaboration between knowledge systems looks like. Not the extraction of useful data points from the Indigenous system and their incorporation into the Western system. Not the translation of Indigenous knowledge into Western scientific language. But the maintenance of both systems in dialogue, each contributing what it is best suited to contribute, each enriched by the other. The model that is emerging, slowly and imperfectly, in the collaborations between Aboriginal custodians and researchers in various parts of Australia, is not a fusion of the two knowledge systems into one. It is a working relationship between two systems that remain distinct, maintain their own integrity and authority, and create space between them where something new can emerge. That new thing, the thing that emerges in the space between traditional knowledge and modern science, is not yet fully named. It is not Aboriginal knowledge. It is not Western science. It is something that is shaped by both and belongs fully to neither. It is a new way of knowing that is beginning to become possible, as both traditions begin to genuinely encounter each other, for the first time, on terms that might allow something real to be produced. The encounter has been a long time coming. 2 centuries of colonial suppression had to be worked through before the conditions for genuine dialogue could emerge. The political and legal frameworks that recognize Aboriginal rights over their country and their knowledge had to be established. The academic conventions that treated Indigenous knowledge as data for collection rather than as a living tradition with its own authority had to be challenged and changed. These processes are not complete. The power imbalances are not resolved. The relationship is not one of equals in any formal institutional sense, though it can be one of equals in the human sense, in the sense of genuine mutual respect and recognition between specific researchers and specific custodians. But enough has shifted for the dialogue to begin, and the results of that dialogue, the specific findings about specific places, the general principles beginning to emerge about what Aboriginal knowledge knows about Australian geology and ecology, the conceptual frameworks that are being developed to hold both knowledge traditions in productive relationship, these results are genuinely significant. They are changing what we know about the Australian continent. They are changing what we know about the nature of knowledge. And they may, if the dialogue continues and deepens, change what we know about the underground world beneath the oldest inhabited land on Earth. There are things beneath the outback that we have not yet found, things that the instruments have not yet reached, things that may require questions we have not yet learned to ask, things that may require a quality of attention that Western science, in its institutional forms, has not yet developed the capacity to sustain. The custodians of the knowledge know where to look. They know what to attend to. They know what questions to ask in the language of their own tradition about the features and the relationships and the behaviors that matter. The researchers are learning to listen, learning to bring their instruments into dialogue with a knowledge tradition that has been in dialogue with this specific country for longer than any other human knowledge tradition has been in dialogue with any specific place on Earth. What will be found? When the listening is deep enough, and the instruments are sophisticated enough, and the relationship is honest enough, no one yet knows. But the direction is clear. The convergences keep accumulating, the correspondences keep appearing. The knowledge keeps being validated, the ground keeps revealing what the elders always said was there. And the story that is emerging at the intersection of the oldest knowledge tradition and the newest methods of inquiry is one of the most extraordinary stories that this planet's human history has yet produced. It is a story about time, about what survives across time, about what a culture becomes when its central project is knowing the land that sustains it, knowing it with everything, with all of its senses and all of its intelligence and all of its capacity for relationship across every generation. It is a story about the land, about what the land is, about what it holds, about what it gives up to those who approach it in the right relationship, and what it withholds from those who do not. And it is a story about knowledge, about what it means to know something, about how knowledge lives, and how it dies, and what we lose when it dies, and what we might recover if we are humble and patient and honest enough to try. The scientists looked. They found what the elders knew was there. And the conversation that this finding opens, the conversation between the longest knowledge tradition and the newest methods, between the deepest attention and the sharpest instruments, between the most patient knowing and the most urgent inquiry, that conversation is only beginning. The country is speaking. The knowledge is speaking. The instruments are beginning to hear. Listen, the story is still being told. There is a name in Australian geological circles that keeps coming up in conversations about the anomalous subsurface features of the interior. Not a famous name, not a name that has made the popular science press. The name of a researcher who spent 15 years in the Northern Territory, working with Jawoyn knowledge custodians on a project that was initially framed as a mineral exploration survey and became something far more complex and far more significant. Her name, for the purposes of this telling, is less important than what she found and what she says about finding it. She describes a conversation she had in the third year of her time in the Territory with a senior Jawoyn man who had agreed to work with the survey team under specific conditions. The conditions included that no excavation would be undertaken at specific sites without full consultation, that she would spend time in the country before any instrument was used there, and that whatever was found would be shared with the community before it was published anywhere. She agreed to all of this. And in the third year, sitting with this elder at the edge of a site that the instruments were showing to have the most dramatic subsurface anomaly in the entire survey area, he told her something that she has been thinking about ever since. He told her that the country there was very old, not in the geological sense, though that was also true. In the sense that the dreaming there went very deep, that there were stories there that had not been told in living memory, stories that were held only in the most restricted ceremonial knowledge, stories that described what was beneath the ground in terms that he could not translate because the translation would require a context that she did not have. He said that the country was waiting. He said it with the same matter-of-fact tone in which he might have described the weather. The country is waiting. Not for anything in particular, just waiting. In the way that country waits. She describes sitting with that statement for a long time, not trying to interpret it. Just sitting with it, in the way that she was learning to sit with things in that place without immediately reaching for the familiar categories. And gradually, Over the days that followed, she began to understand something that her training had not prepared her for, that the country was, in some sense that she could not fully articulate, aware. Not aware in the way that a human being is aware. Not aware in any way that her scientific framework had categories for, but present, attending, responsive to how it was approached. She noticed it in the way the data behaved, not that the data was different from what the instruments should have produced. The instruments behaved as instruments behave, but her interpretation of the data, her ability to see what it was showing her, was different in this place, more layered, more resonant, as if the data was doing more than what she was trained to see in it. She consulted with the elder. She showed him the maps the instruments were producing. He looked at them with interest, but without surprise. "Yes," he said. "That is there, and that, pointing to features in the data that she would not have prioritized without his direction. Features that, when she looked more carefully, turned out to be significant in ways the initial interpretation had missed. It was not that he could read the maps in the technical sense. He could not. But he knew the country. He knew where the significant features were, and his knowing allowed her to see what the instruments were showing her about those features, in a way that her knowing alone had not. The collaboration produced a survey of the subsurface of that particular area that was acknowledged by the geological community to be among the most detailed and accurately interpreted of any survey conducted in the region. And the anomalous features that the survey revealed, the most significant of them, turned out to be located precisely where the Jawin knowledge tradition said the most significant features of the deep country were. She does not make claims about this that go beyond the data. She does not say that the Jawin knew what was below the ground through some form of mystical perception. She says that the Jawin knowledge of the country allowed her to ask better questions, which allowed her to get better answers from the instruments, which produced a better understanding of the subsurface geology. But she also says that the experience changed her understanding of what knowledge is, not that she abandoned her scientific framework, but that she expanded it. That she began to understand, through the experience of working in genuine dialogue with a different and older knowledge tradition, that her framework had been missing something. That there were things about this specific country that the instruments alone, without the guidance of the knowledge tradition, would not have found. The country knows itself. That is what she came to believe, in the careful and qualified language of a researcher who knows how such statements are received in the academic community. The country knows itself, and the people who have been in relationship with it long enough, and carefully enough, and humbly enough, have developed the capacity to access that self-knowing, not through mystical means, through the accumulated practice of paying attention across enough generations that the attention goes deeper than any individual observation can reach. This is the heart of what lies beneath the outback, in the most important sense. Not the mineral deposits, not the subsurface chambers, not the geophysical anomalies, not even the geological history encoded in 65,000 years of oral tradition. The heart of what lies beneath the outback is the knowing of it, the deep, patient, comprehensive knowing of a specific place by the people who belong to it. The knowing that has been built across generations beyond counting, maintained through ceremony and story and relationship, refined by each generation's additional observation and experience. That knowing is what the land holds, not just in the stories and the ceremonies and the people who carry them, though it is in all of those places, it is also in the land itself, in the way the land has been shaped by its long relationship with the people who have known and cared for it, in the way the land responds to the knowledge and practice of its custodians, in the way the country is different, in measurable ways, in places where the traditional knowledge and practice are maintained compared to places where they are not. The land and the knowledge are not separate. They never have been. For 65,000 years, they have been in relationship, each shaping the other, each being shaped by the other, each maintaining the other in the condition that the dreaming prescribes. What the scientists found when they looked beneath the outback was the geological expression of that relationship. The physical traces of 65,000 years of human presence on a landscape, presence that was not extractive and not destructive, but relational and generative, presence that has left the land in a condition that is different from what it would have been without that presence. The land carries the knowledge. The knowledge lives in the land. They are not two things. They are one thing expressed from two sides of the same relationship. And what that one thing says, through both the geological data and the oral tradition, is something like this. We have been here together for a very long time. We know each other. The ground has been shaped by the knowing. The knowing has been shaped by the ground. And in that shaping, something has been produced that is richer and deeper and more full of meaning than either could have been alone. The scientists looked, and what they found, beneath the technical data about geological anomalies and subsurface features and density distributions, was the evidence of a relationship, the longest and deepest relationship between a human culture and a specific piece of the Earth's surface that exists anywhere on this planet. That relationship is the answer to the question of what lies beneath the outback. Not the rocks, not the minerals, not the chambers. The relationship, the knowing. The 65,000 years of mutual shaping that have made this country what it is, above and below the surface. And that relationship, that knowing, that mutual shaping is still going on. The land is still here. The people are still here. The knowledge is diminished. In some places broken, but not destroyed. The ceremonies continue in the communities where the transmission has not been fully severed. The country is still being known by the people who belong to it, in the way that the dreaming has always prescribed. The instruments are new, the dialogue is new, the scientific recognition of what the knowledge tradition knows is new. But the relationship is not new. The knowing is not new, the country is not new. They have been here together for 65,000 years. And the story they tell, the story that runs through the geological data and the oral traditions and the geophysical surveys and the ceremonial knowledge and the living practice of the custodians who maintain it, the story is not finished. It is not even close to finished. The elders warned. The scientists looked, and what was found was not a geological curiosity. It was the evidence of the most profound and most durable relationship between a human culture and its land that the world has ever seen. That relationship is the deepest thing that lies beneath the outback. And the people who carry it, the custodians who have maintained it across 65,000 years of geological time, are still here, still knowing, still warning, still waiting for the world to listen. The ground is patient. The knowledge is patient. The land is patient. We are the only ones running out of time. Listen before the silence comes. The red dust of the interior settles at evening in a way that has been settling in the same way since before the last ice age. The light goes horizontal and gold, and the plains take on a quality that people who have spent time there sometimes try and fail to describe adequately, a quality of age, of depth, of presence. The kind of light that makes you feel small, not because the landscape is threatening, but because it is immense in a way that goes beyond the physical, immense in time as well as space. The people who have always lived here, who have watched this light fall on this country for 65,000 years, know the feeling as something else. They know it as country breathing. As the day completing its conversation with the land, as the transition between the time for moving and the time for stillness, the time for ceremony, the time for the stories to be told. The stories run deep in this light. They run down into the ground and up into the sky and forward and backward through time in the way that the dreaming tells stories, which is not linearly but relationally. The story is not a sequence from beginning to end. It is a web of connections, each element pointing to the others, the meaning emerging not from the sequence but from the relationships. What lies beneath the outback is part of that web. It is connected to everything above it, to the ecology and the culture and the knowledge and the sky and the people and the ceremonies and the stories. It is not a separate thing that can be extracted and examined in isolation. It is a dimension of the whole. The instruments can map it. The surveys can describe its physical properties. The drilling can sample its composition. These are real and valuable forms of knowledge. They tell us things about the physical structure of the deep earth that could not otherwise be known, but they cannot tell us what it means. They cannot tell us what its relationship is to the living world above it, to the culture that has been maintaining that living world for 65,000 years, to the dreaming that describes the relationship between all of these dimensions. For that knowledge, you need the people who carry it, the custodians, the elders, the knowledge holders who have received the stories and the ceremonies and the relational understanding that connects the physical and the spiritual, the geological and the ecological, the past and the present and the ongoing present of the dreaming. Those people are still here. In the remote communities and the station lands and the ranger programs and the cultural programs and the quiet lives of knowledge holders who carry their tradition with them wherever they go, in the cities and the towns as well as the remote country. They are still warning. Not dramatically, not in the language of public alarm, in the quiet, persistent, patient language of knowledge maintenance. The country requires this. The ceremonies require that. These things should not be done here. These things must be done there. The relationship must be maintained. The warning is the knowledge. The knowledge is the warning. And what it is warning us of is not only the danger of disturbing the physical geology beneath specific sites, though that danger is real. It is warning us of something larger, the danger of losing the relationship. The danger of severing the connection between the knowledge and the country, the danger of treating the land as a resource rather than as a living relationship that sustains everything, including the knowledge about it. Because if that relationship is severed, if the knowledge is lost, if the transmission breaks and the ceremonies stop and the country ceases to be known by the people who belong to it, then what lies beneath the outback will remain there, in the patience of deep geological time, unmapped and ununderstood, and in its physical form unchanged. But the living world above it, the ecology that the knowledge maintained for 65,000 years, that will continue its decline. The land that the dreaming prescribed a way of caring for will continue to degrade without that care. The relationships between species, between people and country, between the surface and the depth, relationships that the knowledge was designed to maintain, will continue to erode. The scientists who looked found geological features, important findings, worth investigating further, worthy of scientific attention and resources. But the most important thing they found, the thing that the geophysical data is pointing to without being able to fully articulate, is this. The land they were surveying had been cared for. For 65,000 years, it had been in relationship with people who knew it deeply and maintained that relationship with extraordinary commitment and sophistication. The ecology was shaped by that relationship. The surface was shaped by that relationship. And in ways that the data is beginning to suggest but not yet fully describe, the subsurface has also been shaped, in subtle but real ways, by the 65,000 years of intensive human engagement with the surface above it. The relationship goes all the way down, and preserving what remains of the knowledge tradition that maintained that relationship is not only a matter of cultural heritage, it is a matter of ecological survival. The land needs its custodians, not as a romantic idea, as a physical reality. The ecological health of the Australian interior depends, in ways that the evidence is making increasingly clear, on the maintenance of the knowledge and practice systems that have managed it for 65,000 years, the elders warned. The scientists looked, and what they found, beneath the geological data and the geophysical surveys and the emerging understanding of the subsurface structure of the older stable continental crust on Earth, was the evidence of a relationship that the world needs to understand. The relationship between a people and their place. The relationship between knowledge and land. The relationship between attention and reality. The relationship between the surface and the depth, between the human and the geological, between the living and the deep time patient endurance of the earth itself. That relationship is the deepest thing in the outback. It is what the land carries. It is what the knowledge holds. It is what the elders have been warning about and pointing to and maintaining and transmitting across 65,000 years right up until today. The country is speaking. It has always been speaking. The scientists listened, and what they heard was the voice of 65,000 years of knowing. What we do with what we have heard is up to us. The land is patient. The knowledge is patient. The relationship is patient. We are the ones who need to decide whether we are going to listen. Listen, the story is still being told. Beneath the red dust, in the golden light of evening, in the ceremonies that continue, in the stories that survive, in the instruments that are beginning to map what the stories have always known, beneath the oldest inhabited land on Earth, in the deepest chambers of the most ancient continental crust, in the relationships between species and soil and water and sky that 65,000 years of careful attention have maintained, in the knowledge that has been passed from elder to learner in an unbroken chain since before the last ice age ended. The answer is there. The answer has always been there. It was never hiding. We just had to learn to look in the right way, with the right questions, with the right humility, with the right relationship. The elders warned, the scientists looked. The country spoke. Are you listening? There is a question that sits at the center of everything we have been discussing, a question that the evidence keeps circling back to without quite answering directly. It is the question that researchers in the field talk about in their less guarded moments, the question that elders sometimes point toward with a look that suggests they know the answer, but are not certain it can be put into words that a Western-trained mind is ready to receive. The question is, what did the ancestors know that made them mark these places? Not what do we now know, with the instruments and the surveys and the accumulated geological science of the past century. Not what can we infer from the correspondence between the knowledge tradition and the geophysical data. What did the people who first marked these places, who first incorporated them into the dreaming, who first established the protocols and the ceremonies and the restrictions that have been maintained ever since, what did they know? Because the mark came first. The marking of these places as significant, as powerful, as requiring special relationship and special attention, that came first. The geological surveys that are now confirming the significance of the subsurface features at these places came 65,000 years later. The mark preceded the modern measurement by the entire duration of human occupation of the continent. So what were they responding to? What did the first people to stand at one of these sites feel, see, notice, experience that told them this place is different? This place must be attended to. This place must be incorporated into the dreaming in a way that maintains the relationship and the respect that it requires. Some of the answer is almost certainly in the surface effects that we have already discussed. The unusual plant communities, the unusual animal behavior, the unusual water patterns, the unusual soil chemistry, and the way it affected the things that grew in it. All of these would have been observable to careful and experienced environmental observers, and all of them would have indicated that something about this place was different from the surrounding country. But some of the researchers and some of the knowledge custodians who have been most candid in their discussions of these places suggest that the surface effects alone are not a complete answer, that the people who first marked these places were responding to something more direct, something felt rather than observed in the conventional sense. This is where the discussion becomes most difficult to translate into Western scientific language. Because what is being described in the careful and qualified language of researchers who do not want to be dismissed as unscientific, and in the more direct language of knowledge custodians who are not constrained by the conventions of academic discourse, is a form of perception that goes beyond the five senses, not a supernatural perception, not a mystical ability, but a form of attention so refined, so comprehensive, so calibrated to the specific characteristics of specific places, that it can detect things that instruments calibrated for different purposes would not detect. The instruments detect magnetic field strength. They detect electrical conductivity. They detect density variations. They detect the reflection of seismic waves. Each instrument is calibrated to detect a specific physical property in a specific way. A human being who has spent their entire life, and whose parents and grandparents and all their ancestors have spent their entire lives in deep relationship with a specific piece of country, is calibrated differently. They are calibrated to detect the whole of the country in all its dimensions simultaneously, in the way that a living system that is embedded in another living system can be calibrated. The land affects them. They can feel it. Not in some vague metaphorical sense, in a direct experiential sense. The land has physical effects on human bodies, effects that are real and measurable by the body, even if they are not easily measurable by external instruments. Magnetic field variations affect human physiology. Geochemical emissions from certain geological features affect air quality at the surface. Subsurface thermal anomalies affect ground temperature. Subsurface water systems affect surface humidity and evaporation patterns. A person whose entire sensory experience has been calibrated to the specific characteristics of a specific place, who has learned from childhood to attend to the subtlest variations in how the country feels, who has accumulated generations of transmitted knowledge about how these places behave and what their characteristics mean, is equipped with a form of detection that no single instrument can match. Not because human perception is supernatural, because it is integrated. It reads the whole of the environment simultaneously, with reference to everything known about that environment across all previous experience and all transmitted knowledge. It sees the country the way a master tracker sees tracks, not as isolated data points but as elements of a coherent story that the whole of the environment is telling. This is what the elders were doing when they identified the places that are now showing up in the geophysical surveys as anomalous. They were reading the country, reading it with the comprehensive, integrated, deeply experienced perception that 65,000 years of developing the tradition of reading country produces. And what they read told them that these places were different. Not just ecologically different, though they were that too. Different in their deep character, different in their relationship to the dreaming, different in what was beneath them and what that implied for how they should be engaged with. The instruments are now confirming the reading. The country was different, in exactly the ways that the reading said it was different, in the precise locations that the reading identified as different. The reading was right. This is the conclusion that the evidence supports, stated as plainly as the evidence allows. The Aboriginal knowledge tradition's identification of significant and anomalous places in the Australian interior was not arbitrary, was not driven by purely aesthetic or cosmological concerns, was not disconnected from the physical reality of those places. It was an accurate reading of the physical reality of those places, conducted through a form of perception that is different from, but not inferior to, the instrumental methods that modern science employs. Different because it is integrated. Different because it operates over different timescales. Different because it reads significance as well as quantity, but not inferior in its accuracy about what is there. The places that the dreaming identified as powerful, as requiring special relationship, as connected to deep and significant features of the country, those places turn out to be the places where the geophysical surveys are finding the most significant subsurface features. The deep chambers, the density anomalies, the geological structures that are unusual in ways that the surface gave no clear indication of. The reading and the measurement agree. Not perfectly, not completely, but consistently enough that the agreement must be taken seriously. And if the reading and the measurement agree, then the reading was doing something real. The Aboriginal knowledge tradition was detecting real physical features of the landscape, real differences in the character of specific places, through a form of perception and a system of knowledge that Western science is only now developing the capacity to recognize as valid. This changes things. Not just for the specific question of what lies beneath the Australian outback, for the larger question of what knowledge is and where it lives and how it is best developed and maintained. The Western model of knowledge development is powerful. It has achieved things that no other knowledge tradition has achieved in its domain of application. But it is not the only model. It is not the most comprehensive model. And in the domain of deep, long-term, specific knowledge of specific places, it may not be the most effective model. The most effective model for developing deep and accurate knowledge of a specific place over the longest possible time is the one that Aboriginal cultures developed in Australia. Embed yourself in the place, attend to it with everything you have. Encode everything you observe and everything you experience and everything you know in a form that can survive the deaths of individuals and be transmitted to the next generation. Maintain the transmission through ceremony and practice and relationship. Refine the understanding with each generation's additional observation and experience. Never stop attending, never stop encoding, never stop transmitting. Do this for 65,000 years, and what you will produce is knowledge that no amount of rapid surveying can match. In depth, in specificity, in accuracy about the deep character of the place. The elders knew what was beneath the outback because they had been attending to the outback comprehensively and continuously for 65,000 years. Not each of them individually. Their tradition had been attending. Their culture had been attending. The dreaming had been attending. And what the dreaming attended to was everything. The surface and the depth, the sky and the ground, the living and the geological. The present and the past and the ongoing present of the relationships that structure reality. The scientists looked and they found the evidence of that attending. Not the attending itself, which is not something that instruments can detect, but the reality that the attending had accurately identified and described. The physical features of specific places that the knowledge tradition had incorporated into the dreaming, marked as significant, maintained in ceremony, warned about for 65,000 years. The warning was about what was real, what was really there, what was really different about those places, what was really required in relationship with them, and it was right. Now we need to address something that has been present at the edges of this story from the beginning, something that the evidence circles around without fully landing on, something that several of the researchers who have spent the most time in this territory have raised in their private discussions, even if they have been cautious about it in their publications. The question of what is in the chambers. The geophysical surveys have identified void-like structures at depth beneath significant portions of the Australian interior. They have identified them as low-density features with characteristics that suggest they are either empty or filled with material dramatically different from the surrounding rock. The surveys have mapped their locations, estimated their dimensions, described their geophysical signatures. They have not yet told us what is in them. The drilling programs that are being planned to investigate these features more directly have not yet reached their targets. The sample data that would allow definitive characterization of the material in these features is not yet in hand, so the question remains open. And the Aboriginal knowledge tradition has things to say about it. Not in the language of geophysics, not in terms that translate cleanly into the categories that a geologist would recognize, but in the language of the dreaming, which describes what is in these places in terms of their character, their power, their relationship to the living world above them. Some of what is described is consistent with the mundane geological explanations: karst caves, hydrothermal voids, impact-related fracture zones. These are real geological features that produce low-density anomalies in exactly the way the surveys are detecting, and the character that the knowledge tradition attributes to many of these sites is consistent with what the physical characteristics of these geological features would produce in terms of their effects on the surface environment. But some of what is described is harder to map onto the geological explanations. Some of the sites that the knowledge tradition marks as most significant, as most powerful, as most requiring of careful relationship and most dangerous to approach without the proper protocols, some of those sites have Geological signatures that the geological community has not yet been able to explain through any of the standard mechanisms. The low-density anomalies at those sites are unusually large. The boundaries between the anomalous material and the surrounding rock are unusually sharp. The three-dimensional geometry of the features is unusually regular in ways that natural geological processes do not typically produce with such consistency. These features are the subject of active investigation. They are not yet explained. And the Aboriginal knowledge tradition, in its description of what is in these places, what is there in the deep country beneath the most significant and restricted sites, describes something that has no clear geological category. Not mineral, not water, not void in the sense of empty. Something that the tradition describes as present, as powerful, as ancient, in a way that goes beyond the geological timescales that the surveys are working with, as connected to the dreaming in its most fundamental and most restricted dimensions. The researchers who have heard these descriptions, in the context of the genuine dialogue that some of the collaborations have produced, have responded in various ways. Some have maintained the scientific distance that the academic context requires, and have noted the descriptions as interesting data about the cultural significance of the sites, without making claims about their physical content. Some have privately acknowledged that the descriptions are pointing towards something that the current geological models do not accommodate, without being willing to speculate about what that something might be. And a small number, the ones who have spent the most time in genuine dialogue with the most senior knowledge custodians, have said something more. They have said that the knowledge tradition is pointing towards something real, that the descriptions of what is in the most significant sites, in the deepest and most restricted dimensions of the knowledge, are not metaphorical descriptions of geological features. They are descriptions of something that the tradition knows about and that the tradition has been protecting for 65,000 years. What that something is, in physical terms, these researchers cannot say. The evidence does not yet reach that far. But they find themselves unable to dismiss the descriptions as purely cultural, purely cosmological, without physical content. The correspondence between the knowledge and the geophysical data, in every other domain where the two can be compared, has been too consistent for dismissal to be scientifically defensible. If the knowledge is right about the surface ecology, and right about the mineral geology, and right about the impact history, and right about the sea level history, the default assumption should be that it is also right about whatever it is pointing to in the deep ground beneath the most significant sites. And what it is pointing to there, in the careful and qualified and oblique language of restricted ceremonial knowledge, is something that has been there a very long time, something that has been there longer than the people, something that the dreaming describes as pre-existing the human presence in the country, something that the people came into relationship with when they arrived and have been maintaining that relationship with ever since. This is the deepest layer of the warning. Not about mineral chemistry or impact geology or subsurface karst, about something that was in the country before the people were, something that the dreaming says is still there, something that the instruments are beginning to detect but cannot yet characterize, something that 65,000 years of careful human relationship has maintained in a state of equilibrium with the living world above it. What happens if that equilibrium is disturbed? The knowledge tradition has things to say about that too. And what it says is not comforting. The researchers who have heard those accounts, who have been told in the careful and indirect language of restricted knowledge what the tradition says about what happens when the deep country is disturbed without the proper relationship and proper understanding, have been thoughtful about how much of this to discuss in public contexts. Because the language in which those accounts are given is the language of the dreaming, which is also the language of consequence. And the consequences described are real, not in the metaphorical sense of ecological disruption, though that too is described, but in a more fundamental sense that the tradition describes as affecting the whole relationship between the country and the living world, between the deep and the surface, between the ancient and the present. The elders are not warning about mining in the way an environmentalist might warn about mining. They are warning about something more fundamental, about the disruption of a relationship that has been maintained for 65,000 years, about the consequences of treating the deep country as a resource rather than as a dimension of the dreaming that requires the same quality of relationship and respect as every other dimension. Whether that warning is, in physical terms, about the practical effects of subsurface excavation on groundwater systems and ecological integrity and geothermal stability, or whether it is pointing towards something that our current physical science has no categories for, the research teams that are closest to the evidence are not willing to say definitively. The data is not yet there, but the warning is there. It has been there for 65,000 years. And the pattern that the evidence keeps producing, the pattern of the knowledge being right, consistently right, in every domain where it can be compared to independent physical measurements, argues for taking the warning seriously in every domain, including the domain that the knowledge says matters most. The deep country is not just geology. It is not just minerals and water and void space and ancient rock. It is a dimension of the relationship between this land and the consciousness that has been in relationship with it since before the last ice age. A relationship that the dreaming maintains and describes and prescribes the correct engagement with. Disturb it without that relationship, Ignore the warning that has been maintained across 65,000 years of continuous transmission. Treat what is beneath the ground as a resource rather than as a living dimension of a living relationship. And find out what the knowledge tradition says will happen. Or enter into the relationship. Learn what is required. Work with the custodians who carry the knowledge. Approach the deep country with the same quality of respect and care and attention that the tradition has always prescribed, and find out what that produces. The choice, as it has always been, belongs to us. The elders warned. For 50,000 years, the scientists looked. What they found was the beginning of an understanding that is still unfolding. The rest of the story will be written by what we choose to do with what we have found. The Red Plains are waiting. The ancient Kraton is waiting. The knowledge tradition is waiting. The deep chambers are waiting. In the patience of geological time, in the patience of 65,000 years of maintaining a relationship with a place. The question is whether we are ready to enter into that relationship. Whether we are ready to learn from the longest and most careful tradition of knowing a specific place that the world has ever produced. Whether we are ready to approach the deep country in the way that every dimension of the evidence says it needs to be approached, with relationship, with respect, with the humility that comes from understanding how much we do not know and how much the tradition that has been knowing this country since before the Ice Age does know. The scientists looked. They found what the elders knew. Now we need to decide what to do with knowing that. The country is speaking. It has been speaking for 65,000 years. Listen, before the silence comes. The morning comes early in the Australian interior. Before the light, before the birds, before the heat that will build through the day into something that tests the limits of what living things can endure, there is a moment of darkness that is different from night. A moment when the stars are still visible but the horizon has begun to pale, when the temperature is at its lowest and the air carries that quality of complete stillness that precedes the wind, when the country is most itself. The people who have watched this transition for 65,000 years have names for it. They have ceremonies for it. The movement from night to day is not a neutral physical event. It is a relationship. The light returning is a relationship between the sky and the land and the living things that depend on both. A relationship that requires acknowledgement, that has always required acknowledgement, that the ceremonies of the dawn are designed to maintain. In the communities where the ceremonies continue, where the knowledge has been maintained and the transmission has not been broken, the dawn is greeted in this way, in the way the tradition prescribes, in the way that honors the relationship and maintains the country, in the condition that 65,000 years of attention has refined the understanding of, and in those communities the country is different, not dramatically different. Not in ways that a casual visitor would necessarily notice, but in ways that the careful observer, with the knowledge to see them, can detect. The ecological indicators are different. The species diversity is different. The soil condition is different. The water behavior is different. The country has the quality that the knowledge tradition calls health, what Western ecology calls resilience. What the instruments measure as higher levels of the indicators that distinguish functionally intact ecosystems from degraded ones. The knowledge maintains the country. The country maintains the knowledge. They are in a relationship that goes all the way back to the beginning of human presence on the continent, and that relationship has produced, over 65,000 years, something that no amount of good intentions and no amount of scientific knowledge of ecology can produce quickly or independently. A land that knows how to be itself. A land in which the processes of life have been maintained in sufficient diversity and sufficiency for long enough that the system has developed a kind of deep resilience that can only come from long time, deep time. The Australian Kraton is the record of deep time in the geological realm. The Aboriginal knowledge tradition is the record of deep time in the human realm. Together, they are the story of what a specific piece of the Earth's surface has been and done and become across timescales that challenge our capacity to think in. And beneath the surface, in the geological features that the surveys are beginning to map, the record of even deeper time is preserved. The structures formed by impacts billions of years ago, the mineral concentrations deposited by processes that occurred before complex life. the void spaces carved by ancient hydrothermal systems, the density anomalies that are still being investigated and interpreted, all of it telling the same story. The story of this land. The story of what this land is made of, what it has been through, what it carries, what it holds. And above it all, attending to that story for 65,000 years, the people who belong to this country, the people whose culture has been shaped by this land and who have shaped this land in turn, whose knowledge is the accumulated record of that shaping, whose warnings are the accumulated wisdom of all those generations of knowing. The scientists looked beneath the land. They found the record of deep time. They found the evidence of the things that the knowledge tradition had always said were there. And they are beginning to understand what that means. What it means is this: that knowledge of a specific place, real knowledge, deep knowledge, the kind of knowledge that accurately describes both the physical features and the relational character of a place, requires time. More time than any single human life, more time than any institution, more time than any discipline or tradition that resets its assumptions with every generation. It requires the kind of time that only a culture can provide. A culture that treats the knowing of its country as its central project, that encodes what it learns in forms that survive the deaths of individuals, that maintains the transmission of that encoded knowledge with the same care and commitment that the ecological management of the country requires. 65,000 years, that is the time this culture has been building its knowledge of this country. That is the depth from which the warnings come. The scientists who have listened to those warnings and then looked at the evidence have found that the warnings are real. The knowledge is real, the depth is real, and the land is real. Older than the warnings, older than the knowledge, older than the people. The land that was here before the people came and that will be here after the present chapter of human history has closed. The land that has been attended to with extraordinary care and extraordinary commitment for 65,000 years, the land that the dreaming describes, the land that the instruments are beginning to map, the land that holds, in its geological deep structures, the record of events that occurred before life itself was complex enough to leave fossils. This land is what lies beneath the outback, not just the minerals and the water and the voids, the land itself, in all its dimensions, physical and relational and cosmological, surface and depth, past and present, and the ongoing present of the dreaming. The elders warned, the scientists looked, and what they found, in the data and the dialogue and the accumulating convergences between the knowledge and the measurements, was not just geological features. It was the land speaking. The land that has been attended to for 65,000 years, speaking in the only language that instruments can hear, the language of physical reality. Saying what it has always been saying, through the geological record and through the oral tradition, and through the ecological health of the country, and through the warnings of the elders. This is what is here. This is what has been here. This is what requires relationship and respect and attention. The land is speaking. The question is whether we will finally be ready to hear it, not just with the instruments, not just with the surveys and the drilling programs and the geophysical models, but with the quality of attention that the evidence says is required. The comprehensive, patient, humble, relational attention that the Aboriginal knowledge tradition has been cultivating for 65,000 years, that is what lies beneath the outback. That is what the elders have been warning about and pointing to and maintaining relationship with for all this time. Not a secret, not a mystery, waiting for the right instrument to unlock it, a relationship, waiting for us to be ready to enter into it. With the land, with the knowledge, with the people who have been carrying both across 65,000 years of geological time, the warning was always an invitation. Come into relationship with this place. Attend to it with everything you have. Listen to what it is telling you, respect what it requires, and find out what knowing this land, really knowing it, in the depth and the fullness that 65,000 years of attention produces, what that knowledge can show you about the world and about yourself and about what it means to be human on this earth. The scientists looked. They found the beginning of that knowledge. The elders have been holding the rest of it, patient and careful and committed across all of this time. The country is speaking. Are you ready to listen? The red dust settles. The golden light fades. The stars emerge over the oldest inhabited land on Earth. And in the deep ground beneath the plains, in the chambers and the voids and the ancient geological structures that the instruments are only now beginning to map, whatever has been waiting down there in the patience of deep time keeps waiting. The knowledge keeps being transmitted in the communities where the transmission has not been broken. The ceremonies continue, the songs are sung, the country is attended to, and the story keeps being told. 65,000 years and still being told. That is the story of what lies beneath the outback. That is the story the elders warned about. That is what the scientists found when they finally looked. The story is not finished. It has barely begun. Let us go to a specific place. Let us plant ourselves in a specific geography and walk through what the evidence actually shows, ground by ground, layer by layer, in the way that a custodian of country walks through it, naming each feature and telling its story. The place is the Archaeological Wilderness Sanctuary in the northern Flinders Ranges of South Australia. Not the most remote or the most restricted of the places we could have chosen. Not the site of the most dramatic geophysical anomalies, though it has significant ones, but a place where the dialogue between Western geology and Aboriginal knowledge has been going on long enough that some of its outlines can be described. The Flinders Ranges are geologically ancient. The rocks exposed in the ranges include formations that date back 600 million years to the late Neoproterozoic, when the first complex multicellular life was only beginning to establish itself in the world's oceans. These rocks carry a record of a period in Earth history that is fundamental to understanding the origin of the complex life that eventually produced the humans who now walk among them. The Adnyamathanha people, the traditional custodians of the Flinders Ranges, have a relationship with this country that is, in terms of the evidence currently available, at least 40,000 years old, though the actual duration of occupation may be considerably longer. Their knowledge of the Flinders Ranges encompasses every aspect of the landscape, from the behavior of seasonal waterholes to the distribution of plant species to the locations of sacred sites to the stories of how the ranges themselves were shaped in the dreaming. The geological features of the Flinders Ranges are not generic ancient hills. They are, in detail, extraordinarily complex, recording a series of tectonic and sedimentary events across hundreds of millions of years that produced a landscape of distinctive geological character. The Adnyamathanha knowledge of the ranges incorporates a detailed understanding of where different types of rock are located, how they behave in terms of water retention and drainage, what they support in terms of plant communities, and what their character is in the terms of the dreaming, which are simultaneously ecological and cosmological and relational. When geological surveys of the Flinders Ranges began in earnest in the mid-20th century, they were conducted without reference to Adnyamathanha knowledge. The results were good geology, detailed mapping of the rock formations, identification of mineral occurrences, characterization of the geological structures. But they missed things that subsequent surveys, conducted in collaboration with Adnyamathanha knowledge holders, found. The Archaeology region in particular has been the subject of collaborative geological and knowledge research since the 1970s, when the property was established as a wildlife sanctuary by geologist Reg Sprigg, who had himself been one of the pioneers of South Australian geology and who was remarkable for his time in his recognition that Adnyamathanha knowledge had something to contribute to geological understanding. What the collaborative work has revealed is a subsurface geology of greater complexity and greater mineralogical significance than the initial surveys had identified. The ranges contain within their deep structure evidence of multiple episodes of mineralization, processes by which hydrothermal fluids, heated by deep geological events, moved through the rock and deposited metals in concentrated forms. These mineralization events occurred at various points across geological time. Some are very ancient, some are more recent by geological standards, which still means hundreds of millions of years. The Adnyamathanha knowledge tradition marks certain locations within the ranges as significant in ways that describe their character in the language of the dreaming. Some of these locations correspond to the surface expression of deep geological features related to the mineralization events. The character attributed to them in the knowledge tradition is not a description of the mineralogy, but it describes the surface effects of the underlying geology in a way that accurately identifies the location and the character of features that the geological surveys subsequently confirmed. One example, which can be described at a level of generality that respects the restricted nature of the full knowledge, involves a specific drainage system that the Adnyamathanha tradition marks as a place where the water is powerful. Not merely where the water flows, which is obvious, but where the water has a particular character, where the relationship between the water and the rock and the living things near the water is different from what it is elsewhere. The geological investigation of that drainage system found that it follows, through its lower course, a structural feature related to one of the ancient mineralization events. The water in the lower course picks up dissolved minerals from that feature. The mineral content of the water is different from the mineral content of the water in the surrounding drainage systems. And the plant and animal communities along the lower course, the ones that the knowledge tradition said had a particular character, are different from the communities in the surrounding drainages, in ways that correspond to the different water chemistry. The knowledge identified a feature of the landscape. The geology explained what produces it. The knowledge predated the geological explanation by an unknown but certainly very long period of time. How did the Adnyamathanha know that this water was different? The same way their ancestors knew everything about this country. They observed it. Across enough generations, with enough attention, that the difference became encoded in the tradition as a feature of the character of that place. The different plant communities, the different animal behavior near the water, the different effects of the water on the people who used it over the span of time and observation that 65,000 years of living in a place provides. This is how it works, not through mystical revelation. Through observation, sustained across generations, encoded in forms that preserve the knowledge through the transmission, maintained through the practice of ceremony and relationship, and the ongoing engagement with the specific features of specific places, and the specific features, when the instruments are applied to them, turn out to be real. Geologically, physically, chemically, real. Describable in the language of science. Explainable in terms of the processes that produce them. The knowledge and the science are not in conflict. They are describing the same reality from different positions, with different methods, at different scales of time and resolution. Together they produce an understanding that neither can produce alone. This is the model that the best work in this field is now pointing toward. Not the extraction of indigenous knowledge into the Western scientific framework. Not the replacement of Western science by indigenous knowledge. The genuine dialogue between two different traditions of knowing a specific place. A dialogue that, when it is conducted with honesty and respect on both sides, consistently produces something more complete and more accurate than either could achieve independently. The Archaeology case is one data point. It is well documented. It is publicly acknowledged by the researchers involved and by the Adnyamathanha community members who have been willing to discuss it. But it is not unique. Similar convergences have been documented in the Kimberley, in the Northern Territory, in the Gulf country, in the Cape York Peninsula, in multiple regions of the continent where the geological complexity and the quality of the Aboriginal knowledge tradition have both been sufficient to make the comparison meaningful. The pattern holds across the continent. The knowledge identifies what the geology confirms. Not always, not in every case, but consistently enough to establish that the identification is real, is systematic, and reflects a genuine correspondence between the knowledge, tradition, and the physical features of the land. That correspondence is not coincidence, and it is not, in its deepest form, surprising. It is what you would expect from 65,000 years of careful observation of a specific landscape. It is the natural result of the level of attention that the Aboriginal knowledge tradition has sustained in relation to Australian country across the entire duration of human occupation of the continent. What is surprising, or what should prompt surprise, is that we have taken this long to notice. That 2 centuries of colonial encounter, in which Western science had access to the evidence of this correspondence, if it had chosen to look, passed before the comparison began to be made systematically. that the dismissal of indigenous knowledge as mythology was maintained so long and so completely that the researchers who are now finding these convergences are still, in some academic contexts, required to be extremely careful about how they describe what they are finding. The dismissal was not based on evidence. It was based on assumption. The assumption that people without writing, without formal institutions, without the specific knowledge verification protocols of Western science, could not produce knowledge that was accurate in the domains that Western science valued. The assumption that ecological and geological knowledge required the specific cultural forms of the Western tradition in order to be generated or validated. Both assumptions were wrong. The evidence has demonstrated that they were wrong. The correspondence between the knowledge tradition and the scientific measurements is too consistent and too specific to be explained by any mechanism other than the genuine production of accurate knowledge through the methods of careful, long-term observation and oral transmission. The knowledge is real. The knowledge is accurate. And the tradition that produced it, the 65,000-year tradition of attending to the Australian continent in the way that the dreaming prescribes, is one of the greatest intellectual and cultural achievements in the history of our species. We are very late in recognizing this. But we are recognizing it, and the recognition, when it is complete, will change how we think about knowledge, about culture, about what human beings are capable of when they apply their full intelligence and their full attention to the project of knowing the place they belong to. The scientists looked. What they found validated the knowledge. What the knowledge validated was itself across 65,000 years. And what that validation tells us is something about what human consciousness can do when it is freed from the assumptions of one cultural tradition and allowed to engage with the specific reality of a specific place for long enough. It can know the place, really know it, in its depth and its complexity and its character and its geological foundations and its ecological relationships and its subsurface features and its connections to the sky and the seasons and the deep time of the earth. It can know it in the way the dreaming knows it, in the way that, as the evidence keeps showing, is the most accurate and most comprehensive knowledge of that specific place that has ever been produced. That is what lies beneath the Outback. That is what the elders have been maintaining and warning about and pointing to and transmitting. Not only the geological features, real and significant as those are, but the knowledge of those features, embedded in a tradition that has been refining and deepening and transmitting that knowledge across 65,000 years. The knowledge is the deepest thing. The knowledge is what the instruments are finding the evidence of. The knowledge is what the land has been shaped by. The knowledge is what the people carry. And the warning is the knowledge speaking, saying, "This is what we know. This is what we have always known. This is what the land requires. This is what the relationship demands. This is what 65,000 years of attending to this country has produced. Listen to it. The land is speaking. The people are speaking. The knowledge is speaking. And the instruments, in their own way, in the language of measurement and data and physical science, are saying the same thing. This is real. This is here. This is what the country is. Attend to it. In relationship. With respect. With the quality of attention that 65,000 years of careful knowing has shown is what this country requires. The scientists looked. They found what the elders knew. Now we need to decide what knowing that means for how we move forward, for how we engage with the oldest inhabited land on Earth, for how we treat the knowledge that has been caring for it, for how we enter into the relationship that the country and the knowledge and the people who carry both have always been waiting for us to be ready to enter. The country is patient. The knowledge is patient. We are the ones who need to choose. And in the choosing, we will write the next chapter of the story that has been being told for 65,000 years. The longest story in human history. The story of a people and their place. The story of knowledge and land. The story of what it means to really know somewhere. Really belong somewhere. Really attend to something for long enough that the attending becomes indistinguishable from the thing being attended to. The story of the Australian continent and the people who have known it since before the Ice Age ended. The story that the elders have been telling all along. The story that the scientists are only now beginning to hear. Listen, the story is still being told. beneath the red dust, in the golden light of the outback morning, in the deep chambers of the ancient kraton, in the songs that carry the knowledge from one generation to the next, in the ceremonies that maintain the relationship between the people and the country, in the instruments that are finally, at long last, beginning to confirm what the knowledge has always said. The story is still being told, and now you are part of it. You, listening to this, wherever you are, whatever time it is in your part of the world, you are now connected to this story, to the 65,000 years of knowing that produced it, to the land and the knowledge and the people who have been maintaining both across all of that time. The connection is real. It is as real as the geological features beneath the outback, as real as the oral traditions that have been transmitting knowledge across the entire duration of human history on this continent, as real as the instruments that are now confirming what the knowledge always described. You have heard the warning. You have heard what the elders said. You have heard what the scientists found. Now you carry that knowledge, in whatever form you can carry it, in whatever connection to this story you choose to maintain. The country is speaking. It has been speaking for 65,000 years, and now its voice has reached you. Wherever you are, listen and remember, the story of what lies beneath the outback is a story about what lies beneath everything, beneath the surface of what we think we know, beneath the assumptions that limit what we can see, beneath the categories that define what counts as knowledge and what counts as story. Beneath all of that is something older, something patient, something that has been waiting in the specific geology of the specific land and in the specific knowledge of the specific people who belong to that land for us to develop the capacity to hear it. We are developing that capacity, slowly, with difficulty, against the resistance of 2 centuries of colonial assumption and institutional inertia, but developing it, and as we develop it, what we are finding in the data and in the dialogue is something remarkable. The land knows itself, and the people who have known the land for 65,000 years know it too. That knowing is what lies beneath the outback. That is what the elders warned about and pointed to and maintained across all this time. That is what the scientists found when they finally looked beneath the red dust, in the deep chambers of the ancient kraton, in the knowledge that has been singing this land since before the last ice age ended. The country is speaking. Are you listening? Before this story finds its ending, there is one more dimension to explore. One more layer that has not yet been adequately addressed, and that may be the most consequential for what happens next. It is the dimension of urgency. Everything we have discussed, the geological knowledge, the ecological management, the oral traditions, the geophysical surveys, the correspondence between what the knowledge says and what the instruments find, all of this is a story about what has been, about what was developed across 65,000 years by people who treated the knowing of their country as the central work of human life. But the present chapter of that story is different from all the preceding chapters, because for the first time in 65,000 years, the transmission is genuinely at risk, not just disrupted, genuinely at risk of ending. Languages die. Right now, in the communities that carry Aboriginal Australian languages, more than 200 of which were spoken at the time of European contact, the pace of language death is accelerating. Of those 200 plus languages, fewer than 20 are currently being transmitted to children as a first language. Many others are spoken only by elders. When those elders die, those languages die with them. And when a language dies, the knowledge encoded in it dies too. Not completely. Some can be salvaged through documentary work. But the fully living knowledge, the knowledge that can only be held in the full living context of ceremony and relationship and the practice of managing country in the traditional way, that knowledge requires the language in which it was developed. Translating it loses dimensions that cannot be recovered. The ceremonies are diminishing. The initiation processes through which deep knowledge is transmitted require the sustained engagement of communities with their country and with each other in ways that the social and economic pressures on remote Aboriginal communities make increasingly difficult to maintain. Young people are drawn to the centres, to the towns and cities, by the pull of economic opportunity, and by the reality that the colonial economic system has made it very hard to maintain a traditional relationship with country while also meeting the material needs that the contemporary world demands. The elders are dying. This is not a metaphor or a generalization. There are specific elders known to the researchers who work with them, who carry specific knowledge about specific places that is not yet recorded and may not be passed on before it is lost. The knowledge is in one person's memory. That person is aging. The transmission is uncertain. And meanwhile, the land continues to be developed. Mines open. Roads are built. Water tables are drawn down. Invasive species continue their spread. Wildfire burns through unmanaged country. The ecological systems that the knowledge was developed to maintain continue to degrade in the areas where that maintenance is no longer possible. This is the urgency. This is the dimension that makes everything else we have been discussing not merely intellectually interesting but practically critical. The knowledge that the geophysical surveys are now beginning to find physical evidence for is not safely preserved in archives and databases. It is living in people. In specific, aging, irreplaceable people, in communities that are facing extraordinary pressures. When those people die without the transmission happening, the knowledge dies with them. The geological information encoded in the restricted ceremonial traditions. The ecological knowledge about what grows where and why and how to manage it. The astronomical knowledge about the cycles of the sky and what they mean for the management of the land. The understanding of the subsurface features and what they require in terms of relationship and protocol, all of it, gone. Not recovered by the geophysical surveys, which can find the features but cannot tell us what the features mean, what their character is, what they require, how they fit into the cosmological and relational framework that gives them significance. The instruments can map the chambers. They cannot tell us what the chambers are in the sense that the knowledge tradition means when it describes them. The geophysical data can identify the anomalies. It cannot tell us what the anomalies require, what relationship they demand, what the 65,000 years of maintaining that relationship has produced, and what its disruption would mean. For that knowledge, there is only one source: the people who carry it, the custodians who have received the transmission. The elders who hold the deep ceremonial knowledge in the last communities where it has not yet been broken. The urgency is real. The loss is ongoing. And the window in which the knowledge can be accessed, documented, engaged with in the full living context that gives it meaning, that window is narrowing with each passing year. This is not an argument for cultural preservation as an end in itself, though that argument is valid on its own terms. This is an argument from the evidence that the knowledge is accurate, the evidence that it describes real features of the physical world, the evidence that the ecological management it prescribes produces real and measurable improvements in the health of the land, the evidence that the geological information it encodes corresponds to real subsurface features that the most sophisticated instruments in the world are only now beginning to identify. This knowledge has practical value, not just cultural value, not just historical value, practical value for the management of the land that sustains the living systems that sustain us all, and it is being lost, right now. While the geophysical surveys are being processed and the research papers are being written and the academic debates about the relationship between Indigenous knowledge and Western science are being conducted, the knowledge itself is slipping away. The researchers who are closest to this understand the stakes. They are working as fast as the constraints of their situation allow. The collaborative documentation projects, the cultural mapping programs, the Indigenous language revitalization efforts, all of these are responding to the urgency, but they are working against a tide that is moving faster than they can manage. The question of what to do about this is larger than science. It is political, economic, social, and in the deepest sense, ethical. It involves the choices that Australian society makes about its relationship with its Aboriginal citizens and its Aboriginal heritage. It involves the choices that the global community makes about what kinds of knowledge and what kinds of cultures it values and invests in preserving. But it is also a scientific question. One of the most important scientific questions of the current period. How do we preserve and engage with the most comprehensive, long-term environmental knowledge base that any human culture has ever produced, before the transmission breaks completely and the knowledge becomes inaccessible? The answer requires more than the researchers in the field can provide on their own. It requires the kind of sustained, large-scale, well-resourced commitment that only governments and institutions can make. The kind of commitment that matches the scale of what is being lost. Australia has the capacity to make that commitment. The question is whether the political will is there, whether the recognition of what is being lost is sufficient to motivate action at the scale the situation requires. The evidence is accumulating. The case is becoming clearer with each new study, each new collaboration, each new correspondence between what the knowledge says and what the instruments find. The case for taking this knowledge seriously, for investing in its preservation and in the conditions that make its continued practice possible, is stronger now than it has ever been. The elders have been warning for 50,000 years. The scientists have looked and found what the elders knew. The question now is whether the institutions, the governments, the research funders, the academic establishments will respond to what has been found with the commitment that the findings demand. The land is patient. The knowledge is patient. The people have been patient for a very long time, but patience has a limit. The elders are not immortal. The languages do not preserve themselves. The ceremonies do not continue without the communities that practice them. The window is narrowing, and what lies on the other side of that window, if it closes before the transmission is secured, is not just the loss of cultural heritage. It is the loss of 65,000 years of accumulated knowledge about the oldest inhabited land on Earth. Knowledge that the geophysical surveys are now confirming was real, was accurate, was describing things that are genuinely there. The scientists found what the elders knew. The question now is whether we will do what is necessary to ensure that what the elders know continues to be known, that the transmission continues, that the knowledge survives, that the relationship between the people and the country that has produced this knowledge is maintained and supported rather than eroded and disrupted. That is the deepest challenge that this story presents. Not the technical challenge of understanding the subsurface geology, not the scientific challenge of characterizing the geophysical anomalies, but the human challenge of deciding what we value and what we are willing to invest in maintaining. The knowledge is one of the most extraordinary things that human consciousness has produced on this planet. The result of 65,000 years of sustained, careful, comprehensive attention to a specific place. The result of a cultural tradition that treated knowing as the highest human achievement and devoted its full collective intelligence to that knowing across an unimaginable span of time. It deserves to survive, not as a museum artifact, as a living tradition, in relationship with a living land, in the hands of the living people who have maintained it across all this time and who are the only ones who can maintain it into the future. The scientists looked. They found what the elders knew. Now we need to do what the knowing requires. Support the communities, fund the language programs, recognize the authority of custodians over their country and their knowledge, create the conditions for the transmission to continue, build the partnerships between knowledge traditions that the evidence shows produce better understanding of the land than either can achieve alone. Do what the 65,000 years of accumulated wisdom says is required. Maintain the relationship with the country, with the knowledge, with the people who carry both. That is the warning. That is what it has always been warning. Not just about the geology, about the relationship, about what happens when the relationship is broken, about what needs to happen to maintain it. The land is speaking. Are you listening? Will you act on what you hear? The story of what lies beneath the outback ends here. Not because the story is finished. It is not finished. It will not be finished while the land exists and while the people who know the land continue to carry that knowledge into the future. But this telling ends here, with the evidence assembled, with the convergences described, with the warning heard, with the question posed. What will you do with what you know? The elders warned. For 50,000 years, the scientists looked and found what the knowledge always said was there. The question is not what lies beneath the outback. The question is what we will do about knowing. The country is waiting. The knowledge is waiting. The answer is ours to give. Listen, the ground is speaking. It has always been speaking. And now, for the first time in the long story of the meeting between the oldest continuous culture and the newest methods of knowing the world, we are beginning to hear that is what lies beneath the outback. That is the story. The rest is up to us. There is a moment that researchers who have spent serious time in the field in this area describe with a consistency that is itself notable. The moment when the abstract intellectual project of understanding the relationship between Aboriginal knowledge and geological science becomes something personal, something felt rather than merely thought, something that changes not just what you know, but how you know. It usually happens outdoors, in the country itself, not in the university office where the papers are written and the data is processed, not in the conference room where the findings are presented and the implications are debated, but out in the country, under the sky, in the specific kind of silence that the Australian interior produces, a silence that is not empty but full of the sounds of insects and wind and the calls of birds and the creak of ancient trees, and underneath all of that, something that is harder to name. A researcher who has spent 2 decades working in the Kimberley described the moment this way. She had been out on country with a group of Ngarian rangers for several days, working on a vegetation survey in an area she had visited many times before, with instruments and data collection protocols, but had never spent extended time in simply being. The rangers were taking her to sites that her surveys had passed over or not identified as significant, sites that the knowledge tradition marked as important, but that did not show up in the data as anything special. At one of these sites, a rocky outcrop above a seasonal creek, she sat down with one of the senior rangers, a woman in her 70s who had been on country all her life, and the elder simply stopped talking, stopped explaining, and waited. The researcher, trained in the Western academic tradition where silence in a teaching context usually means a question is expected, felt the impulse to say something, to ask something, to fill the silence with the activity of inquiry. And then, she said, she felt something else, an impulse to simply stay still, to stop trying to extract information and simply be in the place. She sat there for a long time, half an hour, perhaps longer. The sun moved, the shadows shifted, the birds called and went quiet and called again. The creek moved somewhere below her, just audible at the edge of perception. And gradually, she said, the place started to become visible to her in a way that it had not been before. Not in the sense of new visual information. The rocks were the same rocks. The trees were the same trees. The creek was the same creek. But the relationships between them, the way they fitted together, the way the whole site had a coherence and a character that was distinct from the surrounding country, the way she could feel, not just intellectually infer, the difference between being in this specific place and being anywhere else, that became available to her in a way it had not been. And then the elder spoke. She said, "This is what country feels like when you wait for it. It doesn't come to people who are always moving, always talking, always taking. It comes to people who are still." The researcher sat with this for a long time, not because it was mystical or extraordinary, because it was, she said, simply true. The site had a character. She could feel it, not dramatically, not overwhelmingly, but clearly, distinctly, in the way that a note of music is distinct from the notes around it. And when she went back to the data, when she reviewed the geophysical surveys of the area around that specific site, what she found was that the site sat directly above one of the subsurface features that the survey had flagged as anomalous, but that the initial interpretation had not prioritized. A density anomaly at a depth of several hundred meters. A feature that, in the context of what she had experienced at the surface, she now had a different relationship to. The feature had a character, not just a set of geophysical properties, a character that connected the physical anomaly to the surface expression that she had been able to feel, sitting still in the country with an elder who had been attending to that specific place for her entire life. This is what the most experienced researchers in this field keep coming back to. Not just the data, the experience, The experience of attending to a specific place with the kind of sustained and humble attention that the Aboriginal knowledge tradition prescribes, and what that attention reveals. It reveals something that the data alone cannot capture, not because what it reveals is outside the physical world, but because what it reveals is a property of the physical world that standard instruments are not calibrated to detect: the character of a place, the quality of its presence, the way it makes itself felt to a body that is sufficiently still and sufficiently open and sufficiently knowledgeable about what it is attending to. This is not mysticism, or rather, it is the kind of mysticism that is actually just very refined attention. The mysticism of the expert tracker who can tell you that the animal passed here 2 days ago and was carrying a wound on its left flank. The mysticism of the experienced diagnostician who knows what is wrong with the patient before the test results come back. The mysticism of the musician who can hear the wrong note in a chord that most people cannot distinguish from a right note. Refined attention to specific qualities of specific things. That is what the Aboriginal knowledge tradition cultivates, across generations, in relation to specific country. And what 65,000 years of cultivating that attention produces is a form of knowing that goes deeper and is more specific and more accurate than any alternative that has been applied to the same questions. The scientists who have developed the capacity to sit still and listen, the ones who have made the commitment to genuine engagement rather than extraction, the ones who have spent enough time in genuine dialogue with the knowledge tradition to begin to understand how it works, those scientists are finding that the combination of their training and the experience of engaging with the tradition produces something new, a capacity to see both things simultaneously: the geophysical data and the traditional knowledge, the subsurface anomaly and the surface character of the place that sits above it, the geological history and the dreaming history, the measured physical properties and the felt relational character. This simultaneous seeing is not easy. It requires holding open a kind of double vision that the conventions of both the Western scientific tradition and the Aboriginal knowledge tradition make difficult in their own ways. The Western tradition tends to want to collapse the traditional knowledge into the scientific framework. The Aboriginal tradition maintains the authority of the dreaming in ways that resist reduction to any other framework. But in the space between those two tendencies, in the genuine dialogue between researchers who have been humbled by what the knowledge knows and custodians who are willing to engage with what the instruments show, something is emerging that belongs to neither tradition in its pure form, a new way of knowing the land, drawing on the depth and specificity of the longest knowledge tradition and the precision and reach of the most sophisticated measurement tools, producing an understanding of specific places that is, in the assessment of those who have achieved it, more complete and more accurate than any single tradition understanding could be. This is what the story of what lies beneath the outback is pointing toward. Not just better geological models, not just richer cultural documentation, but a new relationship between different traditions of knowing the Canine world. A relationship that might be capable of producing the kind of understanding that the complexity of the world and the urgency of the situation we are in as a species actually requires. The world is complex, more complex than any single framework can accommodate. The Australian continent is complex, more complex than the geological surveys have yet fully mapped. And the knowledge of the Australian continent, held in the oldest continuously maintained tradition of knowing a specific place that humanity has produced, is complex, more complex than any extraction of useful data points can capture. The relationship between these three complexities, the geological complexity of the continent, the cultural complexity of the knowledge tradition, and the complexity of the encounter between that tradition and the tools of Western science, that relationship is where the new understanding is being generated. And the new understanding, where it is emerging, is confirming what the elders have always said. The country knows itself. The people who have known the country for 65,000 years know it too. And what they know about what is above the surface and what lies beneath it is real and accurate and consequential for how we engage with this specific land. The scientists looked, they found what the elders knew, and in the finding, they found something else. something that the encounter with a knowledge tradition of that depth and that duration always produces when the encounter is genuine. They found the edge of what their own tradition knows. And at that edge, instead of emptiness, they found the beginning of another tradition's knowing. A tradition that extends where theirs ends, that knows what theirs does not, that carries what theirs cannot carry. At that edge, the conversation became possible. And in that conversation, the story of what lies beneath the outback began to be told in its fullness. For the first time, the elders warned. The scientists looked. The conversation began. The story is still being told. Beneath the red dust, in the chambers of the ancient kraton, in the songs that carry the knowing forward, in the instruments that are mapping what the songs have always described, in the researchers who are learning to listen, in the custodians who are waiting for the world to be ready to hear. The story is still being told, and what it tells us, in the end, is not about geology, not about culture, not about science or tradition or the politics of recognition and respect. What it tells us is about what it means to be human on this earth, what it looks like when human intelligence applies itself with full commitment to the project of knowing a specific place. What knowledge becomes when it is given enough time and enough attention and enough love for the place it is about. What it becomes is something like the land itself, patient, deep, ancient beyond our capacity to fully comprehend, full of things we have not yet found and things we cannot yet name, and things that will only reveal themselves to the quality of attention that the tradition has been cultivating for 65,000 years. That is what lies beneath the outback. Not just the rock, not just the minerals, not just the chambers and the voids and the geological anomalies that the instruments are mapping, the knowledge of all of it, the 65,000-year knowing, the dreaming that holds it all in relationship, the people who carry the dreaming, the country that the dreaming describes. All of it together in the relationship that has been maintained across the entire duration of human presence on the oldest inhabited continent on Earth. That is what lies beneath the outback. That is the warning. That is the finding. That is the story. The country is speaking. Listen. The red plains of the interior are not empty. They have never been empty. They have been full, for 65,000 years, of the most sophisticated and most durable form of knowing that human consciousness has ever produced, full of the accumulated attention of all those generations of people who treated the knowing of this specific land as the central purpose and highest achievement of human life. That knowing is still there, in diminished but not destroyed form, in the communities where the transmission has survived, in the elders who carry the deep knowledge, in the ceremonies that maintain the relationship, in the songs that encode the country's character in forms that can outlast any individual life. And it is there in the land itself, in the country that has been shaped by 65,000 years of careful human management and deep human knowing, in the ecological integrity of the areas where that management continues, in the subsurface features that the knowledge has always described and that the instruments are now beginning to find. The land carries the knowing. The knowing lives in the land. They are one thing. And when you stand on the red plains of the Australian interior, in the silence that is not empty but full, and you feel the age of the place pressing up through the earth beneath your feet, what you are feeling is not just geology, not just the deep time of the ancient kraton, not just the weight of billions of years of Earth history. You are feeling the 65,000 years of human attention that have been layered over that deep geological time. The knowing that has been deposited in this land through each generation's careful engagement with it. The relationship that has shaped both the land and the people across the entire duration of human presence here. That is what lies beneath the outback. That is what the elders warn about when they say the ground must not be disturbed. Not just the physical features that the instruments can map. The relationship, the knowing. The 65,000 years of accumulated human attention that has made this country what it is. That is what must be respected. That is what must be maintained. That is what the warning is about, in its deepest form. Not just a geological site, a relationship. the most ancient and most enduring relationship between a human culture and a specific piece of the Earth's surface that this planet has ever known. The scientists looked. They found the geological evidence of that relationship. They found the subsurface features that the knowledge had always described. They found the ecological fingerprints of 65,000 years of careful human management. They found the astronomical and geological and ecological knowledge encoded in oral traditions of extraordinary depth and accuracy. And in finding all of this, they found something that changed them, not their science. Their understanding of what science is for, what knowledge is for, what the project of knowing the world is ultimately in service of. It is in service of the relationship between human consciousness and the physical world that sustains it. The relationship between the people and the land. The relationship between the deep knowledge of a specific place and the specific place that the knowledge describes. That relationship is what the dreaming prescribes. It is what the elders maintain. It is what the 65,000 years of transmission have been preserving. It is what the scientists found when they finally looked. The country is speaking. It has always been speaking. In the language of geology and ecology and hydrology and the deep-time physics of the ancient Craton, in the language of the dreaming and the songs and the ceremonies and the stories that have been carrying the knowledge of this country since before the Ice Age ended, in the language of the instruments that are now beginning to hear, in their own way, what the knowledge has always said, the country is speaking. And the message, in all its languages, in all its dimensions, across all the timescales in which it has been transmitted, is the same. This place is real. This knowledge is real. This relationship is real. This land matters. This knowing matters. This people matters. Attend to them. In relationship, with respect, with the quality of attention that 65,000 years of careful knowing has shown this country requires. That is the warning. That is the invitation. That is what lies beneath the outback. The scientists looked. Now it is your turn. Listen. The ground is speaking, and the story is yours to carry forward. The red plains wait. The ancient knowledge waits. The deep chambers wait. The story waits, patient as geological time, for the next voice to carry it forward into the oldest future this land has always known.